Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and unfortunately, I have been spending a lot of time thinking about Fire Emblem 7 recently. Anyone familiar with the channel knows that this is probably my least favorite Fire Emblem, by a pretty significant margin. I am just not a fan of this game, and the more time I spend interacting with it, the more I dislike it. But between being forced to play it as an Iron Man as part of my fundraising stream, and doing a 0% growth playthrough with Stigurna off camera, and watching a couple of friends in VC, as well as just some YouTube streamers playing Fire Emblem 7, I've had a lot of time thinking about it. It has occupied an unusual amount of space in my mind, so in an effort to flush my system of the taint that is Elebe, I've decided to make a tier list. Now, I am of the belief that you're going to make a tier list, you need to explain the criteria, which is why I made an entire video talking about my personal tiering philosophy. If you're confused by anything on the list, I would highly recommend that you check out that video. It is linked below. But if you just want a SparkNotes version of generally what I'm ranking these units over, I'll give it here. I rank the units based on how well they help you beat the game, how much easier using them makes the game, how much they contribute to an entire playthrough. So as a result, I don't care about specific challenge runs, such as LTC, where you try to minimize the amount of turns taken, speedruns, where you try to minimize the amount of real time taken, ranked runs, where you try to accomplish the 5-star ranking on the really arbitrary set of restrictions set in place by Fire Emblem 7. None of that is going to be factored in for ranking these units. However, it is worth noting that often the traits that make units good in those criterias or other challenge runs, such as 0% growths or Ironmans, is also reflected in just standard play, quote-unquote. Making the game easier helps you clear the game. For example, a unit like Marcus is very, very high regarded in LTC because he has extremely high bases and a good movement type, so he can get across the map faster, which helps him get places in lower turns, and because he has really high bases, you don't need to slow down to train him, which is good because if you're clearing the maps in 1 or 2 turns apiece, you don't really have time to slow down and train people. Those are also traits that I would just consider to be generally good. High movement lets you get all around the battlefield and get to wherever you need to go, so in case of an emergency, he can more quickly get to side objectives before they get destroyed, or help rescue units who are in danger and need to get rescued. And his high bases are good because while it's often not especially hard to train units, it is some amount of difficulty. It costs you more to train Lowen than just to use Marcus, who is already good. So as a result, having incredibly high bases is good in standard play, not just in LTC. There are obviously some instances where these criteria won't apply. A famous example is the water walking Ross is not super relevant unless you're playing at an LTC pace. But I will mostly be ranking these units based on what I consider to be standard play. I'm not going to be factoring in things like, oh, well, if you feed this person the talisman in the secret book, then they can give you 1 turn save on chapter 23 or whatever. So one other aspect of my rankings that differs from a lot of Fire Emblem creators is that I penalize for recruitment or promotion costs. So for example, in this game, Farina, the Pegasus Knight, you have to spend gold in order to recruit her, and I do think that that should be factored in terms of ranking her. Some people see this as unfair, as it's not an aspect of their performance, but considering that you are choosing between them and units who don't cost you that amount of gold, I do think that it is fair to penalize them for this. The same applies to the Ocean Seal, which is a unique promotion item for Dart that you can either use to promote him or sell for a large amount of money, more than any other promotion item. So things like this do factor into what units you're going to compose your army of, and as a result, I do think that they should be accounted for when it comes to evaluating the units. Same with when there's cases of exclusive units, such as Corel versus Harkin or Wallace versus Geats. I am going to factor in the fact that you are missing out on the second half of them, or in the case of Wallace and Geats, the fact that in order to get Geats, you have to train the 3 lords to level 50. Last but not least, I do factor availability into these rankings. However, I view it as more of a penalty for low availability than a reward for high availability. Just because you're around from the very first map in the game doesn't automatically make you a good unit, especially if you're not contributing on the maps where you're around. Okay, now for some Fire Emblem 7 specific things. I have the characters here ordered in terms of their Hector mode appearance, and that is because, at least initially, this list is going to be about Hector hard mode without Lyn mode being played beforehand. The experience that you get, there's basically 3 campaigns. Lyn mode is a tutorial campaign and kind of the prologue. It takes place before Eliwood mode and Hector mode. Eliwood mode is the main campaign, but it's missing a few chapters, and generally the chapters are easier than in Hector mode. There's some alterations made to Hector mode chapters that tend to make them harder than the Eliwood mode ones. Either like the enemies get like higher level, or like better weapons or stuff like that. And then Hector mode has access to every chapter, which Eliwood mode does not, and harder versions of the chapters. So I am assuming that we're doing Hector mode without playing Lyn mode beforehand, which is why they're in Hector mode order. I will, at the end of the tier list, shuffle a couple of people around who get moved based on having done Lyn mode beforehand. I think fewer people than you would assume get moved, but there are a few people who uniquely benefit from some of the tools offered by playing Lyn mode prior to Hector mode. So I do want to adjust and show what I think the list would look like if we factored in Lyn mode. That's not because I think Lyn mode is the wrong or right way to play. I just find it more interesting to evaluate the units based on just playing Hector mode as the campaign. And yeah, I like that mode of play better. But I do think there are a few units whose placement moves pretty significantly based on Lyn mode's inclusion, and I do want to also give my thoughts on them. Okay, let's go over the tiers. I've written short little descriptions around each of them to sort of give a better idea of what each of them means. But I will go over in slightly more depth what I mean by these descriptions. So S is the best unit or units in the game. This is a single unit or multiple units who stand head and shoulders over the competition to the extent that it feels that a tier gap is necessary. The way that I order tiers, I do try to order within the tier whenever possible, but having multiple units in between 2 units doesn't necessarily represent a large gap in their performance. So for example, if Hector was the top of A and Lowen was the bottom of A, and there were 12 units in between them, they're still both A tier units. What represents a huge gap is A to S. So if the bottom of S was Marcus, then he would be significantly better than the top of A. Those are all just hypotheticals. I don't actually think Hector is an A tier unit. We'll get to him, but he's not. But A tier is nearly flawless. These are units who, they might have a couple of things holding them back, but their flaws are not so significant that they detract from the good qualities. These are probably going to be your core team members for the majority of the game. The only reason that they're not in S tier is the people or person who are in S tier are so much better than everyone else that it does feel necessary to make that differentiation. B are solid but flawed units. These units have flaws, but their flaws are more significant than the people in A tier, to the extent that their flaws do hold them back from things that you would rather them do. So for example, a unit who has really low movement or really low speed, but everything else is great. Or a unit who just joins incredibly late, but everything else about them is great. That is a flaw that holds them back under availability. But in general, I think you should still use the solid but flawed units. Maybe not every time they're available, but most of the time that they're available. You'll notice the things that hold them back, but that doesn't necessarily, it's not a deal breaker, right? C is outclassed. These are units who you can still use, and they won't give you too many problems, but they are pretty strictly outclassed by the people in S through B. Usually by the people in A and B, because being outclassed by an S tier unit is not a death sentence by any means. But an outclassed unit they're still fine. They might be referred to as filler in other games, You'll notice there's no filler tier here, whereas I usually have filler tiers. In Hector hard mode, you have very, very few deployment slots, so there aren't really any filler units. There's no reason to use a filler unit. If you have 8 slots and you have 8 good units, then anyone who's not getting fielded isn't really filler, they're just outclassed and therefore not getting fielded. Other games, you often have 10 to 12 slots on the average map. So you'll have like 8 good units and then 2 units who you just deploy as filler, because you might as well. They can do like a job here or there. So that's why this would be the filler tier if there were actual deployment slots available, but there kind of aren't. So instead, I think outclassed is a better descriptor of them. D is bad filler. Bad filler, the reason that there's a bad filler tier but no regular filler tier is during the early game, when you don't have enough people to make up your full army, you probably deploy some filler units. Like, if you only have 4 good units and there's 8 deployment slots, then you will deploy 4 filler units. Unfortunately, most of those units are incredibly bad filler. You get, like, the Axe Bros in the early game who are just trash and you're not happy to be using them. You've got the Archers who are just trash and you're not happy to be using them. And it feels bad to call those filler units when they are technically fulfilling a filler role, but they're doing it so poorly that you kind of wish they weren't. And then F is no reason to use aside from memes. This is pretty self-explanatory. These are the worst units in the game, but Fire Emblem 7 is a game where you can use whoever you want. You're not going to get soft lock just because you used all F-tier units. You'll probably have a harder time if you use all F-tier units, but maybe you'll have a more fun time. Like, swimming around with the little shitters, that can be an enjoyable experience in and of itself. I know some people do low-tier challenge runs, and this would be the tier where people who end up in low-tier challenge runs come from. Maybe bad filler as well. But yeah, F-tier units have almost no redeeming qualities, other than that you can laugh at them. Okay, we can finally get around to tiering these units. And we're going to start with one who's probably going to be somewhat controversial, and that is Hector. Hector is the fan favorite lord of Fire Emblem 7. He's definitely the best of the 3 lords, so that's why a lot of people really like him. He's force deployed in every single chapter, but whether or not he's contributing to every single chapter is kind of what I will rank him on, rather than like, oh, well, you should bring him to every chapter because the game literally requires you to. That is an unfair advantage you would get. So all 3 of the lords are kind of modeled after another class, and in Hector's case, he's kind of modeled after Armor Knight. He has high defense, low HP, which is weird for a unit that's supposed to be tanky, but GBA had a habit of giving Armor Knights low HP and high defense. I guess kind of it's supposed to be that they take 0 and that's how they tank, but usually they don't actually take 0. Hector also has bad speed, much like Armor Knights, and when he promotes, he even takes armor effectiveness. Thankfully, Hector has 5 move instead of 4, which would have been a real death sentence for him, but he still isn't great. He's going to be stuck in that 5 move for a long time. He doesn't get his promotion until after Cog of Destiny. At that point, there are 5 chapters left in the game. The Berserker, Sands of Time, Victory or Death, the Kashuna chapter, I think it's called Value of Life, and then Endgame. I'm not counting battle preparations because you don't actually do anything there. It's just a glorified shopping simulator. So there's 5 chapters to make use of his promotion. That's not a lot of the game left. His promotion can also kind of be seen as a downside. I already mentioned that he takes armor effective damage, which isn't a huge deal because FA7 has 2x effectiveness, so effective weapons are a meme. But the bigger disappointment is he gains 2 constitution, up to a grand total of 15. 15 con is very heavy. He is a big boy, because of the heavy armor that he wears, obviously, right? This means that most mounted units can't pick him up anymore. 15 con is incredibly large. Of note, of the like promoted mounted units, Fiora and Wrath are the only 2 who can pick up promoted Hector while also being promoted themselves. It's really tragic. This means that he's going to have to rely on just the 2 of them to get rescue dropped around and dropped to the throne and whatnot, or his 6 movement, or I guess the warp staff. But being incredibly heavy doesn't help him a bunch. Now, the reason you want high con usually is so you can use heavy weapons without being slowed down, but Hector is pretty freaking slow to begin with. He has 5 base speed and a 35% speed growth. So even when he's unpromoted and only has 13 con, that's usually enough to stop him from getting weighed down by his axes, but he'll still be very slow. 5 speed is not going to cut it. Fire Emblem 7 enemies are very weak, but 5 speed is very slow. He can only double things that have 0 and 1 AS. It's very tragic. His combat in the first few chapters is actually pretty passable. It's before the point where enemies have strong enough weapons to actually deal damage to him, so he's usually taking like 2 to 3 damage per round of combat. But even in like chapters 11 and 12, you will notice that the hits wear down over time. 19 HP is not a lot of HP, so even with his 8 defense, he's not the tankiest boy. Getting axes is nice, 1-2 range is nice, and the fact that like he can theoretically, if you train him, tank a little bit for the early game and I guess part of the mid game as well is nice. But I still don't think it's great. I think that he is pretty strictly outclassed by a lot of units in the game. His combat's just like only okay, and then it eventually becomes bad because he gets capped at level 20. Even if you're training him, he's capped at level 20 until the very end of the game. So there's a huge portion of the game where the most you're getting out of him is just like a very under-leveled, unpromoted axe infantry, and you can do a lot better. You can do a lot better than Hector when it comes to combat. One unit who won't do a lot better than Hector when it comes to combat is Mathew. Mathew is a thief, and as such, his combat stats are basically irrelevant. There is one cute thing you can do that I'm not accounting for because I consider it excessive grinding. But in Chapter 11, there is a thief who will like get a red gem, right? And if you steal the red gem with Mathew and then trade it onto Hector, the thief will steal the gem off of Hector, and Mathew can then steal it back infinitely in order to get 10 experience per action and cap his level before you finish the first map, because Chapter 11 is the first map of Hector mode. This makes him a very mediocre combat unit, like discount guy. It's probably better combat than like the Axe Bros and Rebecca, but it's not great, and also I'm not counting it because it is excessive grinding. His combat is pretty bad without it. His combat's not even great with it. His combat's pretty bad without it, so all he really has going for him is thief utility, and it's basically just thief utility for the first half of the game, because once your second thief, Legault, shows up, Legault has like halfway decent combat for that point in the game, and you're probably never fielding Mathew again. With that in mind, where does, I'd say half or a third of the game's worth of thief utility land Mathew? I think Mathew is one of the best thieves in all of Fire Emblem. I think that Mathew is the best non-Thracian thief in Fire Emblem. The only thieves that I would say are better than him are Lara and Lithis, and they have like really weird, cool utility stuff going for them. Here is a not even fully complete list of everything that Mathew steals for you before Legault shows up. He gets you a silver axe and a men's staff in the defend map that's exclusive to Hector mode. He gets you a silver sword, a hero crest, a knight crest, and an unlock in the Lyn indoor castle map where you recruit Raven. He gets you a red gem and a lockpick in Chapter 11. By stealing it from the other thief, you can steal the lockpick. And both of those are just sold for money, but you start with 0 gold in Hector mode. So if you want to be able to purchase like hand axes in Chapter 13, or even just vulneraries to heal up, you need to steal those things. Mathew also steals vulneraries in Chapter 11, which is almost essential for Hector's survival, because you don't have a healer until Chapter 12. And you don't start with a vulnerary. So Mathew is incredibly important for Chapter 11. Moving on, he gets you an Elysian Whip and Guiding Ring in the pirate ship map. So far he's gotten you 4 promotion items. You could theoretically get one of the Hero Crest and Knight Crest by allowing a thief to open it and killing them, but all of the other items listed, except for the silver axe, you need Mathew to get. You also get the silver card from him in the first Kashuna map, and then in 19XX, if you choose to go to 19XX, he can get Eclipse, the Dragon Sheaf, which I don't actually know what that is, and a Talisman. That is an absurd amount of utility. He gets you the first promotion item for 4 different class lines. The first Hero Crest, the first Knight Crest, the first Guiding Ring, and the first Elysian Whip. He is the reason why you even have a functional economy in the early game. He gets you the early silver weapons for 2 out of 3 of them, because Marcus brings you the silver lance. But if you want a silver axe and silver sword, you need Mathew to get them. It is really, really difficult to overstate just how useful Mathew's thief utility is, to the point where I think this is not unreasonable. I have him in nearly flawless, but I think this is not unreasonable. Now, some people give him partial credit for the stuff after Legault. I think that that's fair, because he can still open chests. Anything stealable he probably can't get, because you do need a speed stat in order to steal, and his is kind of shaky in order to steal some of the things Legault would steal, like the white gem in the desert or whatever. But even if you give him absolutely 0 credit for any thief utility after Legault joins, which I don't think is fully fair, but even if you do, I think he ends up near the top of A tier. Mathew is kind of incredible. I think the only reason that I'm not putting him amongst the best units in the game is he just isn't combat. So what he's contributing to your army is very map by map basis. If there's nothing for thieves to do on the map, then you probably don't deploy Mathew, because his combat is truly abysmal. But do not sleep on this unit. Mathew is so important to FE7. Another unit you probably shouldn't sleep on that is incredibly important to FE7, especially the early game, is Oswin. Oswin is actually an Armor Knight, so unlike Hector, who's just modeled after one, Oswin is actually in the Armor Knight class. The downside of that is that he has 4 movement. The upside is that he actually has incredibly good combat. He starts with 28 HP, 13 strength, and 13 defense. His speed value is 5, which is the same as Hector's, which is kind of tragic. He's really only going to be doubling 0 speed and 1 speed enemies. One thing I didn't mention on Hector is that 5 speed is often enough not to get doubled in the early game. It might not sound like it, but it really is. Anything that's not like a mercenary isn't going to be doubling Hector or Oswin. And that's just because FE7 enemies are incredibly low quality. This is good, because it means that Oswin can just, cruise on his bases for a third of the game? Maybe even half of the game? In 0% growths, I continued to use him for an absurd amount of time, despite the fact that he joins in Chapter 12. The speed definitely holds him back, and he will eventually get to the point where, because with 5 base speed and a 30% growth rate, he's not going to be keeping up that fast. Eventually everything's going to be doubling him, and that does definitely wear down on his ability to tank. Thankfully, if you want to, he, unlike most Armor Knights in GBA, is a pretty good candidate for the first Knight Crest, and that gives him 3 speed, which boosts him up to 8, maybe 9 or 10 if he's gotten some lucky procs on level ups. But even if he hasn't, 8 speed is respectable for the point of the game where you get the first Knight Crest, which is the Lyn chapter, the indoor Lyn chapter. I think that Oswin is probably in solid but flawed. A lot of his flaws are similar to Hector's. The speed just doesn't keep up for very long. 4 movement sucks, and he, much like Hector, is incredibly fat. He's got 14 con because of that armor, and so everything I said about Hector in terms of getting rescue dropped around kind of applies to Oswin. It's less of a big deal with Oswin because you don't need to seize with him. And in FE7, the Cavaliers are not great aside from Marcus, so most of the time you are moving close to infantry pace anyway, so 4 move is only 1 less than infantry pace, which is 5 move, or 5 promoted movement is 1 less than 6, which is promoted infantry pace. As a result, he doesn't fall behind so quickly, but it does really suck that he has only 4 move or 5 move, because it just makes it limits the number of side objectives or even main objectives that he can get to in a timely manner. And while I don't subtract from him for like not being very good at LTCing, even if you're not LTCing, a lot of maps demand movement in order to either reach side objectives or reach main objectives. Think the Isadora chapter, right? There's treasure on one side of the room and wrath on the other side of the room, and then you gotta sort of like really spread out for it. Think the Uhai chapter, where you have to catch that thief who's in the fog and drops the torch staff, and it's the only one you can get in the game. Think Genesis, where you've got a bunch of very mobile units like pelting you over walls and stuff, and you want to get to the breakable walls and the doors and move around to be able to fight them. And just Oswin isn't going to be able to get where you want him to as quickly as you would like, which is unfortunate for him. Still, his combat is very, very good. Once he starts getting doubled by everything, his combat is definitely worse, but I still think solid but flawed is a good place for him. If it weren't the fact that both speed and movement were significant issues for him, I would put him in nearly flawless, and I can see the argument for the bottom of A tier, just because gaining those 3 speed off of the Nightcrest does a lot for him. And he starts at level 9, so he's only 1 level away from being able to promote, which is an issue that some other units will run into, in that it's actually really hard to get experience in Fire Emblem 7, because with low quality enemies comes low experience gain, because they tend to be lower level. But I think he's near the top of B is where I'd put him. It's always weird ranking the first like 4 or 5 units, because the list is empty, and so you don't really have a reference of like, oh, so-and-so is higher, like, you know, Oswin is higher than Hawkeye, maybe that's wrong, you know, something like that. So it is possible that some of these people will move as the tier list fills out, but someone who I find unlikely to move is Sera. Sera is the first healer that you get, and she is your only healer for 3 chapters, Chapter 12, Chapter 13, and Chapter 13X, after which you get Priscilla, who is just a better version of Sera. Normally, the trade-off between first healer who's unmounted and first healer who's mounted is the unmounted healer has a higher magic staff or higher starting staff rank. Sera doesn't get either of these. I think the assumption was that you would train her in Lyn Mode, but as it stands, she's just a strictly worse version of Priscilla. You still probably want to use her. You could use both of them side by side for a little bit, because FE7 is a pretty enemy phase heavy game, so you have people who are going to be taking a lot of hits. The enemies are pretty weak, but so are your units early on, so you're going to have people who need healing. And Sera can do that. But she is pretty strictly outclassed, not only by Priscilla, but by whoever you give the first guiding ring to, because Urk, Lucius, and Canas all get stabs if you promote them. At which point, you know, you promote either Urk, Lucius, or Canas, and then your 2 healers are promoted Combat Mage and Priscilla. And there's not really a reason for Sera to stick around at that point. Smellywood. Okay, so Eliwood is the second lord, and he is modeled kind of after a mercenary in that he is a infantry sword-locked unit with more balanced stats. And by balanced, I mean pretty fucking awful. He has 18 HP, 5 strength, 7 speed, and 5 defense. That's not very good. Even for Chapter 12, which is when he joins, that's not very good. His bulk is virtually non-existent. He takes 2 hits and he dies. He can sometimes survive 1 hit. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he's literally 1 shot. But he sometimes survives 1 hit. But 2 hits and he's dead. Which is really unfortunate because he is sword locked, which means that if he's ever doing combat, even on player phase, unless he kills the enemy, he is taking a counter. which means you either have to take the next turn off to vulnerary, or occupy Sera's turn or Priscilla's turn to heal him up. Unfortunately, you know how I said unless he kills the enemy? He's not going to be killing the enemy. He has 5 strength and he uses swords, which are the lowest might weapon. Yeah, this guy's not killing in 1 hit. And sometimes he doubles. You know, 7 speed is actually pretty alright for that point in the game. But it's not great. There's a large number of enemies he won't double. Meaning that his job is basically to do chip and then eat a enormous counter that puts him on the verge of death or potentially even kills him. The biggest utility that Eliwood offers is that he is a free deploy in Chapter 12, 13, 13X, and 14. After that, you have more units than you do deployment slots, and there's not really a reason to deploy him. I guess you could use the rapier. I didn't mention this with Hector, but all of the lords actually get personal weapons. Hector's is the Wolf Bale, which is an axe that is effective against armors and cavalry. It's actually quite useful. It's a good part of his kit, because with weapon triangle advantage and 2x effectiveness, it doubles the might of the Wolf Bale, and often he can one-shot or nearly one-shot cavaliers and armor knights, which are a predominant enemy type in the early game. There's a lot of cavaliers, and while there's not a lot of armor knights, the armor knights that there are often difficult to get rid of. You know, they'll be bosses or whatnot. Eliwood has a rapier, which is a sword that is effective against armor knights and cavaliers. Unfortunately, it's only 7 might, and 2x effectiveness means that when it's dealing effective damage, it's 14 might. Now, normally the upside of effective weapons is that you use them against a very specific weapon type, and when you do, their might is tripled, and they deal massive damage. You know, if the rapier's might was tripled when it was effective, it would have 21 might, which for comparison, the silver sword has 13 might. So it would be a huge increase. Unfortunately, that's just not the case in FE7. It's 2x effectiveness, not 3. So instead, it is 14 might, which is still 1 might more than the silver sword, which would be pretty good, except for 2 things. First is that Eliwood's abysmal strength stat means that having a high might weapon kind of just makes up for what he's lacking normally, and since it's only high might against a specific enemy type, you can't use it for all combats, you just use it for some of them. But then the enemy types that it's effective against are cavaliers and armor knights, and these are usually lance enemies. So the weapon triangle is such that Eliwood is at weapon triangle disadvantage if he uses the rapier against cavaliers and armor knights. Weapon triangle disadvantage removes 1 might from the weapon, and this calculation is done prior to the weapon's might being doubled. So instead of being a 14 might weapon, it is a 12 might weapon. It's just not very good. It's honestly often not enough to make up for his strength deficit, and he struggles to even one-shot cavaliers, let alone armor knights with it. He's doing almost no damage to armor knights with it. So you have a unit who's just like, he's available a long time, but he's not doing much. The biggest thing he does is chip and then eat a counter. So maybe 1 chip every 2 turns. It's really tragic. Now, I should mention his promotion situation, because he is technically speaking a growth unit, you know, 45 attack growth and 40 speed growth and 30 defense growth. Like, I guess those are semi-functional growth rates. They're not, like, super high, and it'll take a while for him to make up for his terrible bases. But if you do drag him through that, his promotion situation is also pretty bad. It's not as bad as Hector's. He promotes using one of the 2 Heaven Seals, which you get one in the Vita chapter and one at the end of Battle Before Dawn. So the earliest promotion opportunity is about 2/3 of the way through the game. And he's only fighting with Lyn over it. And he gains a horse and lances, whereas she gains bows and nothing else. So generally, he is just the strictly better option for the Heaven Seal. Unfortunately, this is not enough to save him. Many people describe this promotion as a discount paladin, but he promotes into a 7-move horse unit with swords and lances. There's a class in the game that has 7 movement, a horse, swords, and lances. That class is Cavalier. Eliwood is a fucking trainee unit. He promotes into a tier 1 class, and unlike other trainees like Ross from the Sacred Stones, he doesn't have the option to then promote a second time and benefit from extra promotion bonuses. He just has to promote into a Cavalier 2/3 of the way through the game. Think about it this way. If Pent and Louise showed up with their friend Joseph, who's a level 1 Cavalier, at the time that they joined, you would laugh and say that Joseph is a terrible unit. Rightly so. Eliwood is like if you had to work in order to get that. You have to level him at least to level 10 in order to promote him into a level 1 Cavalier at the time that Pent and Louise join. This is an F tier unit. This is an F tier unit. Not even turning into a Cavalier 2/3 of the way through the game can save him. Horses are good. They're not that good. But they are very good. Let's talk about, you know that the reason that there's a S in parentheses is that S tier is probably only going to be occupied by one person. S tier is almost certainly just the Marcus tier. Marcus is pretty definitively the best unit in the game, to such a degree that when chatting with a bunch of my friends to try to figure out who we think number 2 in FE7 is, everyone is sort of like, maybe it's this unit, oh, but they have a pretty significant downside. Maybe it's this unit, oh, but they have a pretty significant downside. But number 1, Marcus, is just no downsides whatsoever. He joins in Chapter 12, which is nearly perfect availability, because Chapter 11 is just Hector and Mathew. It's really just a gimmick map, almost a playable cutscene more than anything. So Marcus is available in the first real map of the game, right? He has 11 strength he has 15 strength and 11 speed. I got them flip-flopped. So his offensive stats are fucking amazing. He will delete things faster than anyone else, better than anyone else, especially because he has A-rank swords and lances, and he starts with a silver lance, so if there's ever an enemy you just need dead, he can just delete them. Just give him the silver lance. Yes, it only has 20 uses, but you use those uses to kill things. It's not like you're wasting them, right? He also has B axes. Paladins get axe access in FE7, which means that they can use the strongest weapon in the game, the hand axe. So he can run out into a group of enemies because he has 8 move, get to where he wants to be, put himself in the center of everyone, equip a hand axe, and just delete everyone on enemy phase. Now this does mean he takes a lot of attacks, but he has 31 HP and 10 defense. He can handle a lot of attacks. He's actually almost as bulky as Oswin, and he can get to where you want him to get a lot faster. And he's more offensive than Oswin, because he can use better weapons. That being the axes and the silver weapons, which you do get one of each silver weapon fairly early on in Hector mode, specifically because of Mathew getting the silver sword and silver axe. And Marcus is really the only person who can reasonably reach A-rank swords and A-rank axes by the time you get the silver sword and silver axe. I guess theoretically Guy could reach A-rank swords, but Marcus has it for free, and also he's got better stats, and also he's on a horse. This unit is a fucking god. Now, when it comes to his growths, they're nothing special. They're not terrible. His growths are actually very comparable to Lyn, who is the unpromoted Cavalier who joins at the same time as him. Because, just to look at them side by side, Lyn has 30 strength growth, 30 speed growth, and 40 defense growth. And Marcus has 30 strength growth, 25% speed growth, and 15% defense growth. So he's not going to, his growths are worse, but they're not that much worse. As a result, he's not even, a bad investment target. Although I would say that the amount that his growths are, similar to growth units impacting him is exaggerated. You know, I've heard people say that, oh, Marcus is good because his growth rates are actually pretty decent, so, it's not a waste of experience to use him. But I would argue that the reason that Marcus maintains his relevance going into the late game has nothing to do with his growth rates. It's because his bases are incredibly solid and his weapon ranks are nearly impossible to replicate. A rank, B rank, even if you raise one of the other Cavaliers to the point where their stats are stronger than his, for the most part, they're never going to have AAA rank. And Marcus is very close to AAA. He can have the silver axe by the time you get it. Yeah, Marcus is fucking incredible. Anywhere other than S tier is just incorrect. Unless you're doing a very weird specific context, like you're not allowed to use horses or unarmed units only, or I don't even know. I really can't. I struggle to think of a challenge run where Marcus would end up anywhere other than the best unit in the game. Unless it's a rule set that specifically excludes him, like women only. Yeah, Marcus is fucking nuts. Now, I mentioned Lyn, and I mentioned that Lyn has close to the same stats as Marcus. They're slightly better. You know, he's, especially in the bulk department, with his 40% defense growth and 90% HP growth, Lyn is kind of the bulky Cavalier. You look at the three Cavaliers next to each other, especially if you just did Lyn mode and Lyn shows up third. It sort of paints the picture that Sane is the strong one, Kent is the fast one, and Lyn is the bulky one. I think that this sells Lyn short a little bit. Lyn definitely feels pretty middling, especially when he first joins. He has 23 HP, 7 strength, 7 speed, 7 defense. So worse stats than Oswin and Marcus, but so does everyone. And those are better combat stats than the infantry units, which is not even to mention that his horse is inherently a boon to him that the infantry units lack. Lyn is available from Chapter 12 onwards and is probably contributing more combat-wise than anyone other than Oswin and Marcus. He is never, like, a super standout, especially because by the time you've promoted him, you start getting a ton of very strong pre-promotes thrown at you, and he struggles to catch up to Marcus. Like, he's never going to overtake Marcus, right? I do still think that both because of his early game contributions, like his combat's kind of solid in the early game. It's not phenomenal, and it does feel bad to be like, oh, this unit isn't even doubling. Oh, this unit is 3-hit KOing everyone. But like, when you compare him to his contemporaries in the early game, at least he's hitting and able to like survive more than one round of combat. I think Lyn ends up in B tier under Oswin. I do think that the immediate combat in the early game is more valuable than like the potential to train up to have okay combat, because FE7 throws strong units at you in the mid game. So there's not really that much of a benefit to training up a single unit. It is also worth noting that Lyn is the first unit that we've talked about who's significantly affected by what I'm dubbing growth unit problems. Weak enemies in FE7 are weak because they're low level, and as a result, you get very low amounts of experience. As such, you kind of have to choose like 2 units to train in the early game, sometimes even as little as 1, because there's just not enough experience to pass around. Lyn is probably the best candidate of the people you have in Chapter 12, but there are some people who join after him that are potentially going to outstage him in that department. The good news is that he's around for such a long time that, like, he can pick up the experience early on before you have those other people and sort of get the ball rolling, and he can potentially hit 10 and be ready to promote by the time you get the Knight's Crest, right? And you promote him, then he can just do secondary Cavalier stuff, right? He can theoretically get stats that are comparable or even perhaps better than Marcus if you end up doing that. Won't match the weapon ranks, but his stats will, with investment, pay off to be like, you know, pretty usable. I do think that the low experience gain is something that makes him, he's not going to grow as fast as you want him to, right? Like, 3 or 4 chapters in, you're going to be wondering why he still feels just as bad as he did when you first got him as a growth unit. But between everything that he contributes to those early maps and his potential to be the strongest of the Cavaliers, other than the strongest of the unpromoted Cavaliers, I should say. I think that he belongs in B tier. It feels like a good spot for him. He's a unit who feels bad to use, but I do think he is pretty strong. A unit who feels bad to use that I don't think is pretty strong is Rebecca. Rebecca is an archer. And FE7 is an enemy phase heavy game. What this means is you usually want someone who can run out and kill a bunch of weak enemies on enemy phase. Unfortunately, bows can't counter at 1 range. Ideally, you want someone who has 1-2 range, because then they can counter both 1 range and 2 range enemies. But failing that, someone who has 1 range can at least counter 70% of the enemies, because most of them will have 1 range. Rebecca can only counter enemies who attack her at 2 range. As a result, she ends up being like sort of a player phase unit. She does what Smellywood does in terms of contributing via chip. However, so there's like upsides and downsides. The upside is that unlike Smellywood, she doesn't face retaliation when she attacks. And so she can take multiple player phase actions, right? Without needing to be healed in between them, as long as she doesn't face anyone on enemy phase. If she does face anyone on enemy phase, she's probably dead. And she won't counter even if she survives. At least Smelly would. If he's like taking an attack on enemy phase and somehow doesn't die, he'll retaliate for like 3 damage. Rebecca can't even do that. I think, however, the fact that she can do chip without assistance, without needing like Sera to heal her or like to take a turn off to vulnerary, I think she ends up being better than Smelly would. Bows are effective against flyers, but because of 2x effectiveness, she's not going to be killing flyers. Normally the upside to being a bow user is you can deal like a lot of damage to flyers, and if they're scary flyers like wyverns or whatever, sometimes you can even one-shot them. But Rebecca's not even coming close. She'll do like 6 to 12 damage to a flyer. It's really pathetic. She's better than Smelly would, which isn't saying much, but I do think the ability to not be countered is more valuable than the ability to enemy phase, considering that neither of these units has the bulk to actually enemy phase. Units who could potentially enemy phase, Dorcas has access to 1-2 range. Axes are the best weapon type in the game, and Dorcas has pretty high strength. He could theoretically fight groups of weak enemies, and I think early on, sometimes you just throw him out in a group of like 3 weak enemies and he'll go to town on them. Now his accuracy is a little bit lacking because despite the fact that axes have better hit than they did in FE6, they're still not great. But I find that it is less of a problem considering the abundance of lance enemies in the early game. He usually faces like 60 to 70 hit rates, maybe even 80s at times. It's definitely far from ideal, but it is better than Smelly would say facing similar hit rates and taking a bunch of damage on counter. Dorcas usually, like, he can 2-shot enemies, right? Even if he's not doubling. So you can have someone else set up for him and then have him get the kill. Or he can set up for someone else. He's beefy enough that he can survive the counterattack with room to spare for next turn. And I think he just ends up being bad filler. Like, I'm never happy to use Dorcas, but I do use him for a few maps. And he is contributing during that time. His biggest problem is that he sort of lacks the speed to double, and eventually he will lack the speed and get doubled, which is why you can't drag him out of the early game. And of course, he faces growth unit problems in that if you did want to drag him out of the early game and get yourself a warrior, there's not a lot of experience gain, and he is quite a ways from level 10. He needs like 6 levels, I think, right? Yeah, he's pretty far gone. Now, thankfully, Barter is the fast axe fighter. He has a better speed growth than Dorcas by 10%, so he's the fast one. I mentioned that Dorcas' problem, amongst other things, is that he can't double. Barter gets doubled. Does he end up below Elliewood? I think he's definitely below Rebecca. I think he's below Eliwood. Barter's so bad. No, he's above Eliwood. He does more damage than Eliwood, and he can theoretically attack from 2 range, so he doesn't have to get countered every single time. Barter cannot survive enemy phasing, however. He has 3 base speed. This is horrible. He gets doubled by fucking everything. He gets doubled by 7 speed enemies. And that's assuming that he doesn't weigh himself down with axes, because axes are heavy. And Murder does have a decent con stat, right? But it's not enough that he doesn't get weighed down by every single axe. It's really sad. The 10% speed growth does not make up for the 3 base speed. Like, he's getting doubled by everything. You want to talk about hit issues, too. His skill, he's fucking garbage hit, garbage durability, just garbage everything, garbage unit. He's worse than Rebecca. He is definitely worse than Rebecca. Next up is Guy, and Guy is a unit who I think is actually a little bit underrated. I'm not here to spout some sort of like Guy propaganda where I claim he's a top 10 unit or even a very good long-term unit. He does still have growth unit problems in that he joins as a level 3 unit in chapter 13. And again, low experience means he's not going to be growing all that fast in comparison to growth units in other games. But his combat at base, especially when you consider hard mode bonuses, is actually quite good. If you compare him specifically to the Axe Bros and Lowen, who are sort of your not quite on the tier of Marcus and Oswin level, he ends up with better stats in almost every area. Barter has more strength than Guy, but Guy actually has better speed, skill, luck, defense, and HP. Well, no. Dorcas has more HP, actually. Guy only has 25 HP. But Guy's combat is just really good. He starts with C-rank swords and the Killing Edge, so he's one of only 2 units who can use it at that time. The other one is Marcus, and of course, Marcus is better, so you can just give the Killing Edge to Marcus. But Marcus also can use the Silver Lance if you really need to delete an enemy. So oftentimes leaving the Killing Edge on Guy so that Guy can sometimes also delete enemies, especially since he's doubling fucking everything. He has 13 speed. It's kind of insane. And 8 strength. Like, he's stronger than Lowen, and he's faster than Lowen. This is the infantry trades horse for better combat unit. Now, he is stuck using swords, which are the worst weapon type at least of the 3 main weapons, that being swords, lances, axes. Swords have more hit and less might, which is not something that Guy's never going to be missing anyway, so it's not like a huge deal. He'd rather take more might. And he doesn't have access to 1-2 range, so he's always going to be facing counter, which is definitely rough for him. He also can't really do the thing where you give a unit a 1-2 range weapon and have them fight a bunch of people, which does limit his long-term potential. You know, in the mid-game, if you don't have 1-2 range, you might as well not exist. But I do think in the early game, he's probably your 3rd best combat unit. Like, he does better combat than Hector during the time that Hector's at his best. I think... Do I want to put him in B tier? I think he's either bottom of B tier, top of C tier, as it stands right now. I think I'm going to put him in solid... I'll put him in outclassed. Specifically, he's outclassed by a couple of units who show up later. Raven is the biggest comparison in that they're both unpromoted sword units, but the payoff for promoting Raven is much better than the payoff for promoting Guy, because Guy's stuck with swords even if you promote him. He gets a crit bonus, but it's only 15%. So that's 15% crit bonus is nothing. It might as well be nothing. Yeah, I think he ends up in the outclassed tier. He's quite good, though. He's quite good early on, I should say. Okay, so next up is Urk. And Urk has a lot of problems. He's the first mage that you get, so he has perpetual 1-2 range and can hit on resistance, which is nice because enemies' resistance stats tend to be a lot lower than their defense stats. However, he only has 5 base magic and joins in chapter 14 with these stats, so he's not looking too great on the damage dealing front. He also doesn't have enough speed to regularly double enemies. He'll double armor knights, and he is actually pretty good at killing armor knights because of their high defense and low HP. Him like hitting on resistance lets him double and one-round a lot of armor knights, but he also gets one-rounded quite a lot. Even if he's not getting doubled, he's incredibly frail. In his join map, he actually gets one-shot by the armor knight nearby him, which is a little bit of a threat to him as a green unit. The fact that he can just go over there to fight people and then get immediately one-rounded. It's also a threat to him as a blue unit, as I learned in my Iron Man, unfortunately. But yeah, his bulk is not very good, which runs counter to the 1-2 range, because normally the advantage of 1-2 range in FE7 is you can enemy phase a bunch of people, but Urk just does not have the bulk to enemy phase. He can take advantage of 1-2 range in order to always make sure he's not getting countered. I mean, unless he's facing other 1-2 range units, then he's kind of SOL. But it is mostly a player phase tool. He ends up being a pretty player phase unit, and FE7 isn't a super player phase game. The fact that he's a player phase unit also exacerbates the growth unit problems that I mentioned when talking about Lowen and the Axe Bros and Guy. Urk starts at level 1 in chapter 14. Now granted, his lower level does mean that he'll gain experience a little bit faster than the people at a higher level, but he has less time to do so, at least in competition with like the other mages, because you really want to focus on just one mage. You only get one guiding ring, at least early on, and as a result, spreading your experience too thin means that neither of them are going to hit promotion. You really want to pick one and have that be your training project. And Urk's low level tends to mean that when you recruit the other two mages, in particular Canas, Urk is just lagging incredibly far behind them. As a result, I think he ends up as bad filler, because you do probably make use of his combat for a few chapters, but he either gets one-rounded or two-rounded the entire time. And he's not going to be gaining enough experience to, like, just from player phasing, to catch up with the other options in terms of what mage you're training. Now, there is obviously the idea that you could just #use both. You are not required to only have one mage. But with the low number of deployment slots that Hector hard mode allots for people, as well as the direct competition over the guiding rings in terms of promotion items, it is pretty difficult to justify training more than one. And I do think that, in particular, Canas tends to edge him out. And I'll talk more about the three mages in comparison to each other once we get to Lucius and Canas, because they are, on paper, very similar to each other. But I do think that Urk ends up getting the short end of the stick, thanks to the fact that he's so much lower level, that he's just statistically never going to catch up to the other ones. Priscilla, on the other hand, is very good. So she is a staff bot on a horse. She's basically all utility unit. She can be a healer just like Sera, and that's nice because it frees up player phase actions for people. You know, normally you can just like vulnerary with an enemy phase unit, but some people like Guy or Urk or even like Lowen, if he wants to do something on player phase, or even some of the enemy phase units like Oswin and Marcus do still want to do stuff on player phase, and so being able to heal them up is nice. She can also participate in rescue drops if nobody needs any healing. She can, like, because she has Canto and pretty good aid, she can participate in rescue drops, she can participate in trade cantoing. She's just very good. Basically a better version of Sera. I kind of want to put her in A tier. Healing isn't the biggest deal in the world in FE7, and you don't get the big money stats, those being Warp and Rescue, until very late in the game. So normally the selling point behind your early staffers, right, is, yes, I can promote my unpromoted mages, get them stabs, but they're stuck at E rank. They're probably never going to hit B and A, which is required for Warp and Rescue. But you don't get Warp and Rescue until near the very end of the game, so having Priscilla gain really a lot of staff experience doesn't do too much for you, and the same goes for Sera, to a degree. Barrier, Physic, and Torch are the only utility staves that I think you get in a reasonable amount of time. Now, you can buy Physic in the secret shops, so getting B rank is actually a huge boon. The other downside is, of course, you do get Pent about 2/3 of the way through the game, and he has A rank stats, so he can Physic. He can be your primary staffer if you want to. Still, she's the only staffer on a horse, and I do think that if you have someone else who can use Physic, it frees up Pent to be able to do combat, or you just want multiple healers, she's pretty freaking good. Even if you do end up benching her near the end of the game, I think that the amount that she contributes in the early and mid game is enough to put her up here in Nearly Flawless, which is quickly becoming the utility units tier. Lyn's not going to change that. Lyn does not end up in Nearly Flawless. So Lyn is the third main lord, and she is modeled after a Myrmidon, although she gains bows on promotion, so she sort of branches off from that when you promote her. All of them kind of branch off from their model when you promote them. Lyn's effective weapon is the Manikati. It is basically the rapier with more might and more crit. As a result, her combat ends up just being a better version of Smelly Woods. She's also sword locked like him. She's also frail as shit. She has overkill speed. She will double things that he doesn't. But because she can't really afford to take a hit, doubling isn't a big deal for her, because if she's doubling, that means she's taking a counterattack, and she's even more frail than Smelly Wood. Still, I do think that if you were going to choose to raise one of them, Lyn is the better candidate to raise just because the Manikati is better and she at least can double things, and theoretically that's valuable. However, I'm putting her underneath Smellywood because of the 3 or 4 chapters where he contributes via chip. She doesn't really have anything like that. I guess on Noble Lady of Kaelin, she can help kill the units around her that Kent, N-Sane, and Will are also dealing with. But of the 4 of them, she's probably the worst at doing combat there. And the only reason you're doing that is to keep her alive because she's a game over condition. So I don't know how much credit to give her for this, like, isolated task she does far away from everyone else. I guess she can visit the armory. That's, like, nothing, though. I really do think she's worse than Smellywood. Most of her squad is actually pretty abysmal. Such as Sane. So Sane is the green of the Christmas Cavaliers, and he is sort of supposed to be the stronger of the Christmas Cavaliers, although it is worth noting, because normally the Christmas Cavaliers have some sort of trade-off in terms of one of them is the strong one of them is the fast one. Sane only has 1 less point of speed than Kent, and both of them are doubling about the same number of enemies, the same sort of like tiered enemies with each other. So Sane just ends up being almost strictly better than Kent. The biggest downside he has is he is 1 level lower than Kent. He's level 4 unit at base, whereas Kent is level 5. This does mean that if you, like, in terms of growth unit problems, he needs more experience in order to get to level 10 in order to use the Night Crest. On the flip side, it also means that the fact his stats are strictly better than Kent's is, like, even more outstanding because he gets another level of gained stats in comparison to Kent. All that being said, he shows up just a little bit too late. Growth unit problems are an issue for the people who've been showing up before him, and they maintain an issue for him because he's level 4 showing up in chapter, I think it's 16? It is nice that he can help keep Lyn safe. Of the 4 people over there, that being Lyn, Kane, Sane, Kent, and Will, he's definitely the most competent of them. I do think he's outclassed by Lowen. I don't know if that ends up putting him in the outclassed tier, or if he's solid but flawed. I feel like he's probably Here, having a horse is nice. And if for whatever reason Lowen isn't working out for you, or you just want to use multiple of horses, he's definitely a contributor, and I can even see deploying him in the next map, because it is a big movement-heavy map. And there's a few other movement-heavy maps that he could see deployment in the sort of like beginning of the mid-game. Everything from his join time until Dragon's Gate. I could see him putting in some work with like rescue drops and stuff, and just moving to deal with side objectives. He's definitely worse at it than Lowen, and obviously worse than Marcus. But he's not the worst unit you could invest in. I just question the efficacy of investing in a unit of his caliber at that point in the game. Which, considering that he's basically strictly better than Kent, I think puts Kent at, like, the top of bad filler? This feels really bad. It feels really bad to put a Cavalier this low in the FE7 tier list, because ultimately this is still GBA Emblem, and so you do still get all of the benefits from being on a horse, those being rescue drop, those being Canto, those being able to move at a fast pace, high pace across the map. But I do think that because of the significant gaps in combat quality between your infantry units and your horse-mounted units and your flying units, I feel like a lot of the time in FE7, you end up taking the maps at infantry pace. This is doubly the case because a lot of maps lack anti-turtling incentives. Dragon's Gate is the big one that has any sort of like anti-turtling incentive. New Resolve and Kindred's Bond, I think it's called, the Isadora map, are also to a lesser degree have some anti-turtling. The big one is Dragon's Gate. You miss Legault and the member card if you don't move fast. And then on New Resolve, there's a couple of villages. One of them has an Elysian Whip, which is definitely nice to get. But most of the other ones are fairly ignorable. There's like a Worm Slayer and some other garbage you don't care about. And then in the Isadora map, it's not so much that there's anti-turtling. There is a treasure room that has like the Brave Axe and some gold that can be frustrating to get if you're not moving very quickly. But it's more that is a map where you want to spread out. And so being able to move really far lets horse units and other mounted units get between the different objectives. You know, you've got Wrath on the right-hand side, you got Heath on the left-hand side and the treasure room, you got the secret shop also on the left-hand side, and then you got to protect the center. And so having high movement does let you spread out between them. And I think I'm talking myself into maybe putting Kent at the very bottom of Outclassed. Yeah, I think at the very least, like, he's definitely worse than Sane by a significant margin, and he's definitely worse than Lowen just because of how late he joins. I think Outclassed is probably the place for him. Very, very bottom of Outclassed. Florina. So Florina is the first of the 3 Pegasus Knights, and if I get their names wrong, you'll have to excuse me. I believe it's Florina, Fiora, and Farina. Where is she? Farina? I might be wrong about that, however, because all of them have very similar sounding names, and they're all incredibly middling. Fiora is sort of the exception to the rule that early flyers are good, because she joins with incredibly bad stats. Her constitution is extremely low to the point where she gets slowed down to have 0 speed if she has a javelin or a steel lance equipped. It's awful. She gets weighed down by iron lances. This makes up for the fact that Pegasus Knights are supposed to be the fast units. She's slower than fucking Oswin. She's also much frailer than fucking Oswin. The biggest benefit that she has is that she is the first flyer and can assist with some flyer stuff right from the get-go. There's a cliff that you might want to rescue people over. There's a village that she's the easiest person to get in her join map. Going forward in the port map where you're trying to talk to Fargus, she's the easiest person to sort of navigate around enemies without facing any fire in order to talk to him. In the pirate ship, there's a lot of utility that can be done with flight, rescue dropping people around. In the forests of the Uhai map, she can sort of fly ahead, although there are bow units that she needs to be careful of. 2x effectiveness means that she doesn't get one-shot by bows necessarily, but sometimes she still does, and often she gets doubled because she's weighed down. Unless she has a slim lance, which makes her combat basically non-existent because she has no fucking strength. So she's dealing like 0 times 2 to people. And you also get better flyers than her pretty quickly. I do think that the maps that I've named are the biggest uses of her flyer utility. You can theoretically use multiple flyers, but you have a limited number of deployment slots, and you do want some people who can do combat, and a flyer who can't do combat is usually not making the cut once you have flyers that can do okay combat. I think she ends up in the top of Outclassed. She just has such bad stats that the growth unit problems end up weighing her down to the point where she really can't get out of them. I don't want to discount her contributions on the join map. Getting that village is nice. Getting people over the cliff is nice. And talking to Fargus is nice. But even on the pirate ship map, which is a map that theoretically benefits flying because there's like a lot of open ocean, right? Not really much she can do there. There's not really any side objectives on that map that aren't combat-based. And her combat is pretty abysmal, even if you've trained her a little bit at that point. Yeah, I think Outclassed is probably where I want her. And then we come to Will. So, Will is an archer with comparable stats to Rebecca, who joins later than her. He shares all of the problems she has in terms of like bows, enemy phase, all that fun stuff. Misses the free chip utility portion that she gets to benefit from that elevates her above like Smellywood and Barter. He's still better than her. This isn't some sort of secret Will tech where you end up using him and making him a sniper and training him to 2020 and turns out his stats are exactly perfect for all of this awesome stuff. The most valuable thing that Will does is commit suicide, and I'm not joking. In Noble Lady of Kaelin, Lyn, Cain, Cent, and Sane Kent, I can't keep stopping their names like that. Will, the Christmas Bros, and Lyn are all like isolated in their little corner. Even moving Marcus full move every turn, it's gonna take him 4 turns to get there. They're immediately under assault by 2 Pegasus Knights that are actually a fairly decent threat, considering how frail Lyn is and how middling the Christmas Cavaliers are. Will can position himself at the very edge of the Cavaliers' attack, or the Pegasus Knights' attack range, because they have javelins. The first one will attack him with a javelin, knock him down to about 1/3 HP. He retaliates with a bow, and because of 2x effectiveness, he doesn't kill, and instead just knocks them down to, I would say, about 1/3 HP as well. They've both knocked each other to 1/3 HP. At this point, Sane, Kent, and Lyn can finish off the Pegasuses. Any of them can do it. They all have the weapons in their inventory and the strength to be able to kill the Pegasus after Will has chipped it. Then, the other Pegasus, which is now closer, Will can attack on enemy phase. He knocks it down to about 1/3 of its health. He gets retaliated against by the javelin and fucking dies, but now he's knocked it down so that Cain, Cent, and Lyn can one-shot that as well. And I got Sane and Kent's names flopped again because I suck. But those 2 attacks that result in his death, that require him to throw away the iron bow that he has in his inventory, I truly believe are more important than any of the chip that Rebecca does during the rest of her career. And the same goes for Barter, Smellywood, and Lyn. Because while Lyn can finish off the Pegasuses, the Christmas Cavs can as well. And it is very hard to keep Lyn alive if you don't do that. It's not impossible, obviously. Almost nothing is. But, it's very hard to keep her alive if you don't do the Will suicide. I like to call it free Will because this particular tactic is the reason that I make Will a free unit in drafts on that map. It is, it's not much, but it's honest work. Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. Raven is incredibly good. He's actually similar to Guy in that he joins as a foot-locked, sword-locked unit, so struggles to enemy phase because no 1-2 range, and struggles with the movement-based maps, and he joins at a time where there are a few movement-based maps coming up. Like, he joins in 17, and then 17, 17X, 19, and 20 are all very movement-based, and 21 and 22 kind of as well. I think, despite that, Raven ends up being an incredibly valuable unit. His combat's very good at base. He has 15 speed, so he's doubling just about everything, and 10 strength. He's killing a lot of things that he doubles. His bulk is less impressive with 29 HP and 6 defense, so he can't really enemy phase that well, and this is compounded by the fact that he is stuck on 1 range, so if you do find a group for him to enemy phase that, like, his bulk is appropriate for, you also need to bear in mind that he'll only counter people who attack him from 1 range. And you're getting to the point in the game where enemies tend to be pretty mixed in terms of, like, 1 range and 2 range and 1-2 range. You know, on his join map, about half of the enemies, maybe more than half of the enemies, are archers, so he can't even enemy phase on his join map. His player phase combat is very good at that time. And he does eventually get axes on promotion. He starts at level 5, which is comparable to N-Sane in terms of the amount of growth unit problems he has to deal with before promotion. But he sort of has the trade-off of N-Sane have worse combat overall, but the ability to enemy phase with 1-2 range. And he has better combat, so he can, like, more reliably do stuff on player phase, but less reliably enemy phase because he's not going to counter people, and he'll get experience slower than them as a result, I guess. On the flip side, he is contributing while getting that experience as opposed to doing just self-improvement stuff, but he can't really do the movement-based things that N-Sane do. I think I'm going to go ahead and put him here, in solid but flawed, the very bottom of B tier. I think that his combat is very good. He's basically Guy, if Guy could eventually get 1-2 range. He has that really strong combat. Only Marcus and Oswin will probably outpace his combat at join. And then once he gets 1-2 range, he probably outpaces Oswin's combat because Oswin's speed is really shaky. So even with the somewhat mediocre bulk, I do think he eventually eclipses Oswin between the movement and the speed. Raven's just very, very good. Raven's very good. I think this is a good place for him. I feel like some people would probably want me to put him in A tier, or at the very least, like, top of B, but I do think that Lyn, for having a horse and that extra availability, where he is contributing, you know, maybe less than Oswin and Marcus are, but he's still one of your better units at that time, and Oswin, of course, like, the super standout performance. I think both of them justify a spot above Raven. It's very close. I could see this, but I'm gonna do this. And of course, we can't talk about Raven without talking about his boyfriend. And by extension, we are going to talk about Canas and Urk, partially because Canas is the next unit after Lucius, and partially because these three invite comparisons. You could theoretically use more than one of them, but oftentimes they are fighting over a single mage deployment slot, because deployment slots in Hector hard mode are very tight, and mage is kind of a specialist role. You don't really have... You want bulky units, right? And you don't really have room for that many units that can't take hits. And the mages really can't take hits. Despite perpetual 1-2 range, they're generally worse at enemy phasing than the physical units who have access to, like, javelin and hand axe 1-2 range. They're really good at both deleting enemies that have high defense and at being sort of utility units, as they can do combat and heal once you promote them. In addition to fighting over the deployment slots, they are fighting over guiding rings. So I do think it is fairly reasonable to say that they are in competition with each other, because you can't really use all of them. Not effectively. Like, someone's going to be lagging behind if you try to use multiple mages, I feel. Lucius is... I love him. I really, truly do. I really, truly do. Lucius is fucking tragic. Now, before people jump on me about how the fact that all three of the mages have very comparable averages if they're at the same level. And this is true. The mages do, if you set them all to the same level, have very comparable averages to each other. If you look at them all at level 10, very, very comparable averages to each other. They're going to have very similar damage outputs. Why are we assuming that they're the same level, though? Lucius joins as a level 3 unit on Chapter 17. And honestly, on Chapter 17 is being generous. Because by the time you get Raven over to Lucius to recruit him, because he's super far out of the way in his little jail cell, right? The map is basically over. Functionally, Lucius can't do much until Chapter 17X. And on Chapter 17X, you get Canas. And Canas starts at level 8. Now, they are fighting over the Guiding Ring, because at this point in the game, you really do want the bonus that comes from promoting with the Guiding Ring. Lucius gets C staves if you choose to give him the Guiding Ring, right? And that is his selling point. Well, the other selling point is he has really high magic growth. 60% magic growth is kind of nuts, especially considering that his base is 7 as well. Like, his base magic is 7 at level 3. He's going to have incredibly high magical might. He uses the weaker magic type of light, though, and so that kind of counters it out. So instead, the big selling point is if you choose to raise him and make him your mage of choice, he ends up with C rank staves. Why are you wasting all of that experience raising a level 3 unit when you get a level 8 unit who joins at the same time? Functionally, Canas and Lucius are joining at the same time as each other. And Canas is 2 levels from promotion. You could easily run the numbers and take into account tome might. You know, lightning is the weakest, flux is the strongest. Look at their average magic stat, look at their average speed stat, all of that fun stuff, and talk about how, okay, these 3 units are actually fairly identical to each other. And the Oifi bot would lead you to believe that they should be all right next to each other on the tier list. But I said it once, I'll say it a million times. There's more to units than simply their raw stats. And the fact that Canas joins at level 8 means that the Guiding Ring is basically his property. You know, it shows up in Chapter 18. He joins in 17X, 2 levels away from being able to use it. Lucius joins in 17X, 7 levels away from being able to use it. And if, as people argue, Lucius, and Canas all end up relatively the same, which is a philosophy that I subscribe to. Like, I think if whoever you raise as terms of your mages will be doing roughly this equivalent amount of combat. Why would you bother with the units that take much more work to raise and offer you no substantial upside over the person who comes basically for free? I think that ends up putting Canas into B tier where they're in D and F. The reason I have him towards the very low end of B tier is because his job is kind of replicable by them. It just takes much more effort and experience and kind of pulls away from, like, Raven and Lowen's experience that they want. And also is just, you know, you can talk about, like, oh, well, it's easy to raise units in Fire Emblem, and to a degree it is, but it is still work that you're doing, and it is still resources that you're spending. The EXP is the resource. So why not, even if this is easy, this is free, you know? I'll take free over easy every day. If the payoff is the same, I'll take free over easy. Speaking of free, not the Ocean Seal. Siddharth joins in Chapter 19 as a very mediocre combat unit. He joins on the Uhai map. His inventory doesn't do him any favors. Steel Axe is not the weapon he wants to be using. I would say that even if his inventory were better, he wouldn't be doing too much. He's like the definition of a filler unit in a game where you don't get deployment slots for filler units. On his own, without any mitigating factors, I think he would probably end up in, like, bad filler. However, there is the matter of the Ocean Seal. The Ocean Seal is the promotion item for pirates, and Dart is the only pirate in the game, so he's the only person who can use the Ocean Seal. The Ocean Seal also costs, I think, twice as much as other promotion items. You're not paying for it because it's not for sale in a store, but you're functionally paying for it because you could sell it and get a lot of gold for selling it. Now, FE7 kind of has a reputation of money not being an issue, right? And part of that is because of everything Mathew does for you. You know, he helps your economy in the early game. He gets you the silver cards so you can get stuff at half price. Part of that is selling the Ocean Seal. The Ocean Seal and the White Gem, which you get in the treasure, are huge influxes of money. And I think that Dart should rightly be penalized for the fact that you have to sacrifice a large chunk of money if you want to use this unit long term. I don't want to use this unit long term. Is he worse than Lyn? He's worse than Smellywood. I don't think he's worse than Lyn. He might be worse than Lyn. He's just incredibly mid-combat for one map. I don't even think it's worth deploying him in Chapter 20 in Dragon's Gate. In 0% growths, I didn't deploy him after Join. Like, that is the caliber of unit that he is. And it's not like his growths are what helps him, right? If anything, that's the setting where he should be better, because you haven't had the ability to grow Lowen. You haven't had the ability to grow Guy, or Hector, or Sane, or Kent, or whoever else, right? He's just not doing it for you. Even if you do raise him and spend the money on it, and you get a really middling Berserker, constantly remember that you paid for this unit. Okay, next up is Fiora. And God, the Pegasus Knights in this game are so disappointing. She's not trash, but she really feels like it when you use her. They all do, kind of. They all do, kind of. So Fiora joins 4 chapters later than Florina, with marginally better bases. Like, she has 2 more strength, 2 more defense. She has 4 more speed and 1 more con, which is functionally 5 more speed because the pegs have so low constitution. She still gets weighed down by fucking everything. She'll get doubled if she holds anything heavier than, like, an Iron Lance. Her growth rates are slightly worse than her sister. Florina has, like, 5% more strength and defense. Oh no, Fiora has 5% more defense, Florina has 5% more strength, Florina has 5% more speed. The growths are close enough that they might as well be fucking identical. The big advantage of Fiora is, I've talked about growth unit problems before. Fiora is level 7. That means she only needs 3 levels before she can use the Elysian Whip. And she gains some con off of that because of promotion. She gains just the flat stats, she gains extra movement, and she can use swords, which ironically is actually a benefit for her because her con is so low that she wants to use lighter weapons. She can't enemy face worse shit, because she's just like not bulky whatsoever. It's not even like an archer problem, because archers only deal 2x effective damage. It's just that her bulk is functionally non-existent. Like, 21 HP and 6 defense is so tragic. It's so tragic for the point in the game that she joins. And it's not like her growths are going to benefit her to the point where, like, oh boy, 25% defense growth. Look at me, I'm Miss Tank over here. I think she ultimately ends up barely edging out her sister, mostly just because of the 4 levels that you don't have to grind her. I think that starting at level 7 versus level 3 is the big thing. I think if the 2 of them were flopped and she was auto-leveled to 7, like, it would be easily this. I literally think it's just that she's closer to promotion that benefits her. Of worth noting, just talking about promotion, right? I mentioned earlier that Hector is incredibly fat and mounted units struggle to pick him up, thanks to the way that the female aid formula works. The fact that she has extra con, that 1 extra point of con, actually eliminates her from the pool of units who can carry promoted Hector while being promoted themselves. Her sister, Florina, can carry promoted Hector while she is promoted. And because if you're doing rescue dropping stuff, like the extra point of movement is actually relevant, it is worth noting that that is like a niche, and if you care enough, like investing in Florina so that she can rescue Hector is potentially useful on like Victory or Death, because that's a big seas map with like rivers that you want to carry him over and stuff. Otherwise, I do just think being closer to promotion is makes her better. It's still not great. Like she's so disappointing. It's so heartbreaking because Pegasus Knights are actually usually pretty good, especially in GBA, but like FE7 just seems to be the exception to that rule. Okay, so next up is Legault, and Legault is thief number 2. And I know a lot of people like to give the second thief only half credit for all of the stuff that they steal, because, for example, in this case, Legault comes second, you have Mathew. If you wanted to, you could have Mathew steal the white gem in the desert, or you could have Mathew steal any number of other stealables that Legault steals. I think this is a bit silly. I think Legault should still get full credit for all of the stuff that he can steal, for 2 reasons. One, Mathew can't necessarily steal things if it's like literally stolen from a person. And the reason for that is that in FE7 and onwards, your speed stat actually affects how many things you can steal. And so Legault just having a better speed base than Mathew means that he will steal those things, and oftentimes Mathew fails to hit those benchmarks. Mathew needs to level up speed at least once, even to steal all the things that Mathew steals. Legault is probably able to steal some stuff that Mathew can't. Unless your Mathew gets incredibly lucky, Legault has exclusive access to some treasures. But aside from that, it is similar to the conversation I had about Sane and Kent, right? Kent is never under any situation getting the Night Crest because he's just strictly worse than Sane. Mathew is never under any situation that you have Legault being deployed to be your one thief, because he's strictly worse than Legault. Legault can actually function as a combat unit, Mathew can't, no matter how much you train him. He's just never going to be even close to Legault's level of combat. And Legault isn't even good at combat, he's just better than Mathew. As a result, I think Mathew should get full credit for all of the treasures that, or not Mathew, Legault should get full credit for all of the treasures that appear after Legault joins, but before Jafar. He's still worse than Mathew. The things that he steals for you are much less impactful. He can get you the Brave Axe, which is nice, but you can get it without him. You've got chest keys at that point. He can get you some gold, which is good. He can get you white gem, which is good. I believe there's a stealable promotion item. I can't remember which one. But the times when Legault is actually benefiting you by stealing stuff are few and far between. There's actually a surprisingly scarce amount of stealables in the second half of the game. And as a result, Legault just ends up not feeling great. When you do deploy him, you're never happy about it, because deployment slots are incredibly tight in the mid-game. If you want that white gem in the desert, you've got 8 slots to work with. It feels real bad to deploy Legault, because you've also got the Dancer filling up 1 slot most of the time after Legault has joined. I think Legault ends up in bad filler. I have him above Dorcas and Urk. That might not even be correct. He might be worse than them. I feel bad putting him here. Fire Emblem's first canonically bisexual character, but he just doesn't have that many redeeming factors. Like, I do give him full credit for all of the treasures after Mathew. Or rather, after Legault joins, right? Like, I don't think Mathew steals credit from Legault. I still think Legault is just really disappointing. You're never happy about deploying him. And if you can, like, either skip a treasure, decide that treasure's not super important, or be like, okay, well, I'll let a thief open it and then, kill the thief and get it as a droppable, right? You usually prefer to do that. It feels bad to field Legault. It really does. His combat's fine, but, like, fine isn't really cutting it when you've got so few slots, and you've got units whose combat is not fine. Like, whose combat is actually good. He feels bad to bring along. Thief utility is definitely nice. His thief utility is very limited. A utility unit that does have a lot of use, however, is Ninian. Ninian is this game's dancer, and dancing is historically one of the most powerful tools in Fire Emblem. It gives whoever you want an extra action, and this can be used to extend movement range, this can be used to give someone multiple attacks, multiple staff uses. The list of possibilities is endless, and as a result, dancers usually show up around the halfway point just because of how strong they are. Ninian is no exception. She shows up on New Resolve, and she's absent for Sands of Time for plot reasons, and absent for... Well, she's not technically absent for the Berserker, but you have one deployment slot, and you can deploy Nils, but you probably shouldn't. She's also absent on Battle Preparations, which is mostly a fake map, but ironically, Battle Preparations is a map where dancers would be useful because you can arena grind extra by dancing with your dancer. So it does kind of suck to miss that. They're like the one unit who I would penalize for missing Battle Preparations, and they're the only unit that misses Battle Preparations. It's kind of tragic. I say they because Ninian and Nils are the same character. They level up identically to each other. So in Lyn Mode, you start with Nils, and whatever levels you get on Nils apply to Ninian when you get Ninian in Eliwood and Hector mode. And then later, for plot reasons, Ninian goes away, and when she comes back, she's Nils, and he has all of her levels and her inventory. So functionally, they are a single unit. That is why Nils does not exist. I think it's silly to rate them separate from each other. I've seen some people try to do it, as the idea is Ninian gets more chapters, but Nils is available for Victory or Death and the final map, both of which are very important maps for your dancer. I think that's a silly approach. I really do. One side effect of the fact they are a split unit is that she semi-plays on casual mode. If Ninian dies prior to the plot events that cause Ninian to die, because Ninian dies in the plot, right? But if she dies as a unit prior to dying in the plot, Nils will still be able to be deployed starting in Victory or Death, the first map where Nils is available. Or Nils is actually available in the Berserker. So starting in the Berserker, Nils becomes available. Even if Ninian dies, you can still field Nils for the last portion of the game. That is definite upside. It's pretty minimal because, like, if you get your dancer killed, that's on you. I feel like you made the mistake, but it is nice for, like, Iron Mans, for example, to be like, oh, well, I guess it sucks that I don't have Ninian for a few chapters, but I'll get Nils eventually. And I think that's pretty cool. In addition to the standard dancing, Ninian has access to the 4 dancer rings. One of them boosts strength, one of them boosts defense, one of them boosts crit, one of them boosts hit, all by plus 10. This is usually worse than just dancing. There's a few, like, very niche exceptions where you can boost a unit's stats to hit thresholds they wouldn't otherwise. I know LTC has Athos crit with the rings, but I think in standard play you almost never care about using the dancer rings. It's a bigger deal to just dance. For example, like, if you're boosting someone's might with the dancer ring, right? What you could do is just have them attack, then dance, have them attack again. So unless that might boost is the reason that they were dealing damage to begin with, they almost always deal more damage if you just dance them and have them attack a second time. The defense one, I guess you can help with tanking or whatever, but I'd rather just dance. Dancing is just so good. Despite missing half of the game, I feel like Ninian probably belongs here. Like, her availability is definitely bad. This is pretty standard for dancers, however. And during the time that she's there, like, she is your dancer. I think that most dancers are a little bit overrated, simply because, like, there is sort of the question of how much credit do you give to the dancer for the actions of the person that they danced, and that varies from game to game. I think in Fire Emblem 7, you probably give a little bit of credit for the actions of the person that they dance, but, like, Ninian dancing Marcus's second action is like 70% Marcus still. But 30% Marcus is still a very fucking good unit. I think Ninian is probably an S tier unit. Next up is Isadora. And Isadora is in a very weird place. So she is a pre-promoted paladin who joins on Kinship's Bond. And her offenses are actually fairly comparable to a level 15 or 10-5 or 15-1 or however you want to phrase it, version of N-Sane and Lyn. If you've promoted them and given them 15 levels. She's pretty comparable offensively. She has 16 speed, which seems like a lot more than they have, but she's got 6 con, which is pretty bad. She'll get weighed down by a lot of things to the point where N-Sane and Lyn are averaging around 12 speed, and she's usually slightly below that. Her strength is still passable. She has 13 strength, which is on the lower end. It's about average what Kent will have, and it's obviously well behind Sane. But it's ahead of Lyn, which is nice. The big things about her, one, she has weapon rank, right? Weapon rank is good. She has better weapon ranks than probably your trained Cav does, especially in the swords department, because you end up using lances a bunch. And as such, the silver sword that she joins with is like basically only usable by her, Marcus, and Raven under most circumstances. Her weapon ranks are very good. She's also free. You know, you didn't have to spend the Night Crest on her. You didn't have to invest all that early game experience in her. I've talked a bunch about growth unit problems, and she doesn't face them. Like, she starts out promoted. That's awesome for her. She's also really fucking frail. She has 8 defense and 28 HP. Comparing her to the other Cavaliers, even the weakest of them, Kent, has 10 defense and 33 HP. And then if you look at Marcus and Oswin and Raven, and the case just gets worse and worse for her the more you look at her. In an enemy phase heavy game like FE6, it's really unfortunate that the area where she is at her worst is bulk, because it means she can't run ahead and enemy phase a bunch of units. Now, in any other game, she could easily be a filler unit, right? She is a paladin that you get for free, and oftentimes the roles of suboptimal paladins that you get for free is to do less good, but still good combat. You know, think Zealot in FE6 is usually going to see some amount of deployment because you just want another combat unit. Think Ford or Kyle in FE8, you know, think Joffrey in FE9. They end up seeing deployment just because they come for free, and Paladin is a good class line, and even if they're not as good as your highly trained ones, they're still decent. But in FE7, you just don't get the deployment slots for filler units. And as a result, she ends up just struggling to get fielded. You know, if you've got 8 slots, and one of them's got to get taken up by a dancer, oftentimes one of them has to be taken up by a thief, and then you've got a good combat unit taking up a bunch of the other slots. There's just not really a space for a filler unit like Isadora. As a result, I think she also ends up outclassed. Is this too far? I think she's worse than the other Cavaliers, actually. Maybe not the Christmas Cavs. She's probably better than Hector. Maybe worse than Sane? She doesn't have to deal with his growth unit problems. I think this is probably the right place for her. I just don't see many instances where you're deploying her in the mid-game. And then when you finally do get the deployment slots for her, she's really fallen behind. You know, think Cog of Destiny. You get a bunch of slots in Cog of Destiny in Sands of Time. There's a long time in between her join time and those maps. And, like, her bases really don't hold up on those maps. They're already only barely acceptable when she joins. It's just kind of tragic for her. Wrath. Okay. Wrath is a bow unit. But thankfully, he is only 1 level away from promoting and getting access to swords. Swords are also not a great weapon type, TBH. Still, because you don't have... I mean, look at the other 2 bow units, right? You don't have a lot of other bow units. Look at the people who can get bows on promotion. He sort of, kind of gets automatic access to, like, the brave bow and the long bow and every good bow you have, just by virtue of being the only bow unit who has functional stats. And I think that carries him a long way, right? Just nearly exclusive access to those weapons with passable stats and a horse. His horse is also really beneficial because he's one of only 3 mounted units that can rescue Hector while promoted themselves, and Hector's promoted. Oh no, he's one of 4. He's 4 who can do that. It's Wrath, Florina, Priscilla, and Heath are the only 4 units who can do that. And I think that that niche is worth acknowledging. Still, at the end of the day, he is just a bow unit. He's a bow unit on a horse with decent stats and nearly exclusive access to the good bows. But I don't think I can put him any higher than, like, bad filler. I'm never happy to deploy him, especially because he joins around the time that people of higher caliber than him join, right? Isadora joins at this time, Heath joins at this time, Hawkeye joins at this time, Pent joins very soon after, Geets, if you get him, joins very soon after. I think this is probably right for him. It feels weird to put him underneath Dorcas. He's actually, okay, the mount utility alone, he's probably a better unit than Dorcas. I just struggle to... I'm never happy about fielding him, but I'm also not happy about fielding Dorcas. I just don't have any other options, which I guess is kind of the case with Wrath. I think this is a good place for him. I think this is... I value him less than Legault's Thief utility, I think. Speaking of Heath, because I was mentioning units of higher caliber than Wrath, Heath is definitely higher caliber than Wrath. Heath's speed and starting level are his biggest downsides, right? So he starts unpromoted level 7 during the same chapter that Wrath and Isadora join, right? And he will still face those growth unit problems because he's going to be, you know, lagging behind because of that. It's less extreme for him because, 1, it's only 3 levels until promotion, and 2, there are, granted, they're still pretty weak, but they're at least somewhat stronger enemies than in the early game. You know, I, in 0% growth, managed to get him to level 10 in the desert, almost by accident. I did a little bit of combat on his join map, and then a little bit of combat in the desert, and he hits 10. So it's definitely less of an issue with Heath. Part of this is because with hard mode bonuses, his bases are, like, actually pretty passable. He's got good strength, good defense, okay-ish speed. On promo, his speed problems, they don't fully go away, but they become a lot less exaggerated. When he promotes, Heath basically hits the same speed tier as Hawkeye, and Hawkeye's speed tier is good enough. He's not going to double heroes and mercenaries and maybe the occasional non-hero promoted unit, but other than that, he's doubling everything he needs to. He's flying. He's got lance access. He can use swords, I guess, if you want him to, because his con is pretty low, but it's not low enough that he's weighed down by, like, he's weighed down by 1 by a javelin, right? So he's not weighed down to the absurd extent that the Pegasus Knights are. I think I'll put him in nearly flawless, the very bottom of nearly flawless, because those 3 levels are a flaw. But I do think that the issue, those 3 levels, is slightly exaggerated. It is easier to get him the 3 levels that he needs than to get any of the early game units the levels that they need, right? Partially because you have competent units around you to help train him. So even if it takes a little bit longer, right? When you're trying to train Lowen, you've got Marcus and Oswin, and that's it in terms of people who can help set up kills and train for Lowen. When you're trying to train Heath, you're going to have Isadora, you're going to have Hawkeye, you're going to have Marcus still, you're going to have whichever Cavalier you've made into a Paladin, you're going to have Canas, you're going to have Raven, you're going to have Hawkeye, you're going to have Pent. You have other options for setting up kills and helping Heath. And once you get him to 10, like, his problems aren't completely over, but he's bulky, he hits hard, he doubles most things, and when he doesn't double, like, he's still performing well against them just by hitting hard and not taking much. And he has 1-2 range and flight. He's, like, the only flyer who I don't feel bad using. And I think that belongs in A tier. Okay, now we get to Hawkeye. And Hawkeye is a bit of a bugbear of mine because I think this unit is criminally underrated for a unit that most of the community acknowledges is pretty good. Hawkeye joins you in Chapter 23, Living Legend, so around halfway through the game, and he has 50 HP, 18 strength, 14 defense, 11 speed, 14 skill, and 10 res, 13 luck. The defense, res, and HP combined make him far and away the tankiest unit in the game. 50 HP is a huge number, and it is complemented by high defensive stats on both ends of things. Now, the res is often a little bit memed on as one of the worst stats in the game, and I would agree that in many games, including Fire Emblem 7, you can supplement poor res through Pure Waters and Barrier Staffs, right? Or just by killing mages before they have the chance to kill you. However, there are some maps with dangerous mages, in particular Cog of Destiny, but also Battle Before Dawn, Night of Farewells, all have dangerous magical enemies. So having that combined bulk, where you are both physically and magically tanky, with high HP, high defense, and high resistance, is super valuable. He's able to use axes, best weapon type in the game. 18 strength and 11 speed is actually really good offenses too. For context, that is the same strength stat as Pent's magic, and Pent joins much later than Hawkeye. 11 speed is kind of shaky, but at the point in the game that he joins, he actually doubles everything on his join map other than the bosses. He only has a 25% speed growth, so he's always going to be behind your faster units, but he's still going to be good enough to double probably 2/3 of the enemies that he faces, especially when you consider this high constitution means that he's not weighed down by the axes that he wields, and therefore actually has 11 speed or whatever his displayed speed value is, as opposed to the Pegasuses who have less than that. Hawkeye is very, very good combat-wise. He won't double Merms, he won't double heroes, and he won't double some faster promoted enemies like Sages, but for the most part, he's going to double everything, and he's very rarely going to get doubled. Maybe some faster bosses will double him, but even that is often untrue. And even if he gets doubled, high defense, high HP, high resistance, like, this unit is fucking cracked. You get him so early, well, not so early, you get him halfway through the game, but he has better combat than, like, Pent, for example, who everyone praises as the darling of the game. I think easily Hawkeye is the second best combat unit in the game. Easily. Like, this is closer to happening than this. Hawkeye is almost an S tier unit. I think the biggest thing that holds him back is he's missing for half of the game, and 16 con means it is difficult to rescue him around. He's a very beefy boy. But other than that, his problems are virtually non-existent. And you're moving at infantry pace in FE7 anyway, just because of how weak your flyers and mounted units are. So not being able to rescue him around is definitely a downside, but it's not like he fails to see combat. He has infantry movement. This isn't Oswin, right? Like, this isn't, oh no, I'm moving like an unpromoted unit. This isn't Hector. I mean, you already have to have Hector get dragged around because of his fat ass. Hawkeye's fine. I mean, he's more than fine. He's fucking phenomenal, but his movement is fine. So now we have Wallace and Keats, and this is our first pair of exclusive units. And they're a little bit weird when it comes to exclusive units, because normally the only thing you take into account in terms of recruitment costs with exclusive units is missing out on the other half. So Wallace would be penalized for the fact that you don't get Geats. But in this case, they are influenced by the level of the Lord characters. So Hector, Eliwood, and Lyn's combined levels. If it's 49 or lower, you get Wallace, who is by far the worst choice. And if it's 50 or higher, you get Geats, who is definitely the better choice. Normally, I would say that I penalize Wallace for this, because you're losing out on the better unit. However, Geats is much, much harder to get, because if you'll notice, Hector, Smellywood, and Lyn are actually very low on the tier list. I'm gonna make a quick correction. I think Lyn is better than Dart. She's not the worst unit in the game, he is. But other than that, they are still very bad units, right? And you have to use all three of them, and they can't promote by this time. So they do need to be 2 of them at 20 and 1 of them at 10. Or you get some flex room if, like, one of them is at 15, one of them can be at 15 again, and then one of them at 20, They just need to have a combined level of 50, but you do have to use all of them, and I think that that is a high enough cost that, like, Geats gets penalized a little bit for that, as opposed to Wallace getting penalized for missing out on Geats, just because, like, it's really, really obnoxious to train them to, even if you are using them, hitting that level is really obnoxious. Like, I've done playthroughs where I trained all 3 lords and didn't hit the threshold that it needs to be. Just because 50 is so high. If it were something more reasonable like 40, I would say that even that kind of penalizes Geats, but it's like more reasonable. 50 is absurd. So as a result, Wallace does not get penalized for the fact that you miss Geats. Doesn't help him much, though. Does he end up here? I think he probably ends up here. Yeah, I think he ends up here. So Wallace is a general with middling stats other than bulk, who joins after you just got Hawkeye, who has better bulk than Wallace. And better stats in every other aspect as well. 5 move is just really bad. And I think it's 8 speed is his speed base. Fucking abysmal. This guy is pretty awful. If I penalized him for not getting Geats, he would probably be even worse than Dart. So be lucky that Geats is really obnoxious to recruit. Training Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector is just too high of a cost. There's really no reason to deploy Wallace. I guess theoretically his bulk can do some stuff if you're really desperate. I know that in 0% his bulk is useful in exactly 1 map. I don't think that that's the case in vanilla play. Like, you will have trained people with good bulk. Maybe even fucking Hector will have better bulk than him at the time Wallace joins. Like, and that's saying something, because you know my feelings about Hector. Yeah, it's really tragic. It is very tragic. Geats, on the other hand, the tragedy of Geats is that nobody gets to use him. I do think he's a little bit overrated as a result of people sort of talking about him without ever using him. I think that because his recruitment condition is so obnoxious and as a result so few people use him, there's sort of the image of the perfect Geats, right? You know, like, oh, Geats is actually better than Hawkeye because he can use bows. He has B-rank bows and B-rank axes, and he gets to use the Brave Bow and all that fun stuff. And as the #1 Hawkeye defender, but also just as someone who has used Geats in quite a few playthroughs, I just don't think that's the case. Both of them have upsides and downsides compared to each other. Hawkeye is a little bit bulkier, because Geats only has 44 HP and 12 defense compared to Hawkeye's 50 and 14. Hawkeye also has that mixed bulk with the resistance, which you can supplement Geats' bulk with a Pure Water or Barrier, but you can also use those on Hawkeye to further boost his already solid resistance. So on maps where mages are a threat, Hawkeye's bulk is significantly better than Geats's. On the other hand, Geats has better offenses than Hawkeye. He has 1 more point of strength, but notably 3 more points of speed and a 40% speed growth, meaning that on average, he will be at least 1 speed tier ahead of Hawkeye. Now, Hawkeye doubles almost everything he needs to. Geats doubles everything he needs to. Maybe heroes are outside of his doubling range, especially if he's using heavier weapons, because he does only have 13 con, but for the most part, Geats is going to double everything you want him to, whereas Hawkeye doubles almost everything you want him to. So there is a difference there, right? B-rank bows is also quite useful. Wrathfan's in shambles, the Brave Bow is no longer his personal weapon. Geats can use the Brave Bow, take advantage of his massive 19 strength, and just delete units without facing a counter. He might even be able to quad some slower units just because his speed is pretty alright, his con is pretty good. Yeah, Geats is very solid in terms of his offenses, and the biggest downside is lack of res, which you can supplement to a degree, but it is relevant. And the fact that in order to get this unit, you need to train 3 of the worst units in the game, and train them all to a kind of absurd degree. They need to hit the level 50 by the end of the desert map, or by the end of Genesis, depending on whether you do the desert or Genesis. I think that those are enough flaws that Geats ends up in solid but flawed below Oswin. I really don't like training the lords for him, and I do think that, like, if you get him, he should be a part of your team, because he's pretty phenomenal. But you might not get him. You probably won't get him. Another unit who you might not get is Farina, and that's because she actually costs 10,000 gold to recruit, which is kind of absurd, and definitely above asking price for her stats. Thankfully, the Ocean Seal costs 10,000 gold, so you can just sell it. Dart cries in the corner because he can't promote into a Berserker, but I guess he can buy Estrogen and transition into a Pegasus Knight, so that's always awesome. Farina continues the Elebian Pegasus Knight tradition of just having really disappointing stats. She joins 5 or 6 chapters after Fiora. Actually, it's more than that. It's like 7 chapters after Fiora. And what does she have to show for that? 2 more strength, 1 more speed, and 4 more defense. The extra bulk is appreciated because of how frail the other pegs can be, but is it enough to sort of pull her above her younger sisters? I don't think so. She doesn't have growth unit problems because she joins at level 12, so she can promote immediately, which is nice. But ironically, she also has the highest growth rates out of all 3 Pegasus Knights. She has a 50% strength growth, a 45% speed growth, and a 25% defense growth. Granted, that is a lower speed growth than Fiora, but it's only by 5%, which is 1 point of speed over the course of 20 levels. And to make up for that, the 50% strength growth on top of her 10 base strength means that if you do choose to grind her in her join map, you will get dividends for that. You'll get rewarded with a pretty good Falco Knight. You can also just instant promote her, and then you don't have to deal with grinding her, which is good because not grinding her means that she doesn't deal with growth unit problems. Whereas, like, I guess it's a double-edged sword because she doesn't have to deal with the growth unit problems because she's level 12. But if she were a lower level, she would benefit from those insane growths much more than she does now. I think that between her availability, like, she misses the chapters of good flyer utility and misses some time to grow that Fiora has. And she costs you money, actually. The 10,000 gold is non-negligible. I know FE7 has a reputation for money being infinite, and, like, Mathew contributes to that by getting you the silver card. But money can be tight. Like, there's the secret shop in Dragon's Gate where you want to buy a bunch of physics staves. I think that... Is bottom of outclassed good enough for her, or does she need to be in bad filler? Because the other thing is that you have Heath at this point, and you have Hawkeye, and she can't rescue anyone because her con is too high. So, like, she doesn't even get that fake utility, right? I mean, it's not fake utility, it is real utility, it's just, like, it's rarer than you would think. You're about to get Pent, like, you get Pent in the next map. You already have Hawkeye, you potentially already have Geats. Her combat's really not that outstanding. Like, it is just the fact she can fly, and Heath can fly too. I think the very bottom of Outclassed is where she belongs. I could see bad filler, but I think she's just outclassed. I do think that being on a mount, being a flyer, has enough upside even in FE7 that I'm not putting her in D tier. It's close. It's very close. But it's not like her stats are abysmal, right? Like, they're serviceable. For the time she joins, they're serviceable. Pent's stats are also pretty serviceable for the time that he joins. He joins, so the obvious comparison is Hawkeye, right? Because they're both extremely dominant units with 1-2 range, who sweep up huge portions of the game. If we look at their stats side by side, Pent is faster. They have equal attack stats. Pent's magic is 18, Hawkeye's strength is 18. Hawkeye's probably grown a little bit by the time you get Pent, but not a ton. Like, he's a level 4 promoted unit, and growth unit problems apply to the promoted units as well. Like, he's maybe gotten 1 point of strength. It's not enough to be, like, super relevant. Pent is faster by at least a whole speed tier. He has 17 speed at base and a 40% growth, so he will get it faster than Hawkeye does with his 25%, right? On the other hand, Pent is slightly less bulky. not slightly less bulky, he's significantly less bulky. He has 11 defense and 33 HP, which is very respectable. Like, for a mage, because mages are usually frail, 11 defense and 33 HP is very respectable. 30% defense growth and 50% HP growth also means that, like, it's not like he's not gaining bulk. He won't gain it as fast as some of your physical units, but it's not like he's not gaining it. And the extra speed does contribute to his avoid. He can't take advantage of triangle to help with avoid, but the extra speed does contribute a little bit. I don't think that the dodge tanking is reliable enough to make up for the significant physical bulk advantage that Hawkeye has. Pent has an advantage in terms of magical bulk, but one of the few enemy types that hitting on res doesn't improve against is magical enemies. So Pent really doesn't want to enemy phase against magical enemies. Yes, he has perpetual 1-2 range, but so does Hawkeye. He's got hand axes. Like, at this point in the game, you have infinite hand axes. So the perpetual 1-2 range isn't a big deal. Hitting on res is, but the decrease in bulk and decrease in availability, I do think makes Hawkeye better than Pent. Now, what Pent does have going for him is he starts with A-rank anima and A-rank stats. So he can use bolting, he can use physic. He can use barrier if you want him to, but that feels like a waste of his turn. Like, just have Priscilla use barrier, right? Bolting and physic are the big ones. He has a huge physic range. So if you don't have something for him to do on player phase, he can heal someone else up. He contributes to other people's bulk in that respect. And the fact that it is long range means that you can have him fight on one side of the battlefield, send Hawkeye to fight on the other side of the battlefield, and he can heal Hawkeye. Now, he usually needs healing more than Hawkeye does, but the fact that he has a large range physic is definitely relevant, and, like, it makes you stop fielding units like Canas or Urk or Lucius or Sera or whoever else is your staffer. Like, Pent just becomes the only mage that you need. I still think Priscilla gets fielded because of horse utility, but Pent is the only dismounted mage that you need at that point. Once you get Warp and Rescue, he is your best Warper and Rescuer. Warp and Rescue show up super late. The only maps you have Warp for are Sands of Time, Victory or Death, Value of Life, and Endgame. It's useful to have Warp in all of those maps, in particular Sands of Time to get the body ring for Athos, and Endgame in order to warp Athos around, and then Victory or Death is a huge Seas map, and warping Hector to the throne is definitely a way to get him there. But I think that the impact of A-rank stabs is mostly physic. It is nice that he can warp on those late game maps. I don't think that that's as impactful as many people do. With all of that out of the way, he is still absolutely an A-tier unit. My only question is whether he goes here or here. I think that he is definitely worse than Hawkeye as a combat unit. I think that he is definitely worse than Mathew, because Mathew gets you so many promotional items and early weapons and just so much good stuff. The question is Priscilla's early game and mid game and honestly late game utility better than Pent's combination of late game combat and late game utility? And I think, honestly, I think they're basically even. I'm going to put Pent below Priscilla because it'll piss people off, and this is the most overrated unit in all of Fire Emblem, but I think that these two units are of equivalent quality. I honestly think that both of these are equally reasonable takes. And not even just in like a, oh, it's your preference thing. I think that they contribute an even amount to playthroughs. I really do. It's kind of incredible. Like they're really just the same. I mean, they're not. They do very different things, but they're the same in terms of how much they contribute. This would be an interesting poll question for Eat Your Greens. Which of these units is better? Because, I mean, it wouldn't, because people would vote Pent because of the memes, but if people didn't vote Pent, it would be interesting. Louise, on the other hand, Pent's other half. So she, how many units can you say have exclusive access to the Brave Bow before it's no longer exclusive? If you didn't get Geats, and if you haven't promoted Wrath, she's the exclusive Brave Bow user. It's reasonable that you didn't get Geats, but I don't know, you probably promoted Wrath. She probably has better combat stats than him, but she's stuck in Sniper, so she can't even do, like, the Hector rescue stuff that he can, right? I think she goes in bad filler. The biggest thing that she has to contribute, and the reason that I don't think she's a meme, is that she can give Pent additional bulk because they start with an A support, and Pent has the ice affinity. And I think that you have to spend a second deployment slot to make Pent's bulk not even as good as Hawkeye, but approaching Hawkeye's. I think that that is utility that she offers that's more than anyone else in the F tier. I think it is the very bottom of bad filler. She can do combat if you do that as well, but I think that the biggest boon you get from deploying her is you spent an entire deployment slot to make Pent better. And honestly, sometimes I want to spend an entire deployment slot to make Pent better. Because as much as I just shit on Pent, he is still one of the best units in the game. Like, he's a top 5 non-dancer unit. Dancers always feel weird to rate because they are such weird utility. And in fairness, so is Mathew. So, like, if we're just talking about the units who are not Thief and Dancer utility, he's either 3 or 4. Because he feels like he's tied with Priscilla. So he's a top 5 unit. A deployment slot to make him a little bit better is sometimes worth it. And that's the only reason she's not meme tier. Okay, so the next pair of exclusive units to each other are Corel and Harken. Their recruitment condition is really weird. It has to do with how many promoted enemies you killed, except for not specific ones who are Hector mode exclusive, or how many doors you opened. It's really bizarre. But the long and the short of it is, because both conditions are equally easy to get, I'm penalizing Corel for being the worst unit. He is a fast, pre-promoted swordmaster with okay strength, but no 1-2 range, and not especially high bulk. This is not a recipe for a good unit in Fire Emblem 7, especially not in the end game. He missed the point in the game where you can afford to be a sword-locked infantry unit, right? Like, Guy and Raven benefit from that. Corel doesn't. I think Corel might actually be worse than Dart if you account for the fact that you miss Harken and miss the Brave Sword, because Harken has the only Brave Sword in his inventory. It's kind of tragic that Corel doesn't have the Brave Sword. Like, not only are you getting the worst unit, but you're missing out on one of the best weapons in the game. It's kind of stupid. But Harken's bases are fucking absurd. Harken has 23 strength. Harken has 18 speed, 16 defense, 42 HP. This man comes with some capped stats if he rolls well on his hard mode bonuses, but he doesn't even need them. The worst version of Harken is still endgame ready. This unit joins one map after Pent. He joins at the end of the map after Pent joins, but the map where Pent joins is a fake map because it's the Vita Survive map, and you just stand still for 11 turns and then the map is over. So functionally, Pent's only map that he has over Harken is Harken's join map, because Harken doesn't join until the end of that map, right? As a result, the fact that Harken has better combat than Pent, but only misses one map than him, makes him like a very comparable unit when it comes to just the combat utility. Now, I do think the existence of Physic pushes Pent over Harken, but only by a little bit. Like, Harken does have just strictly better combat than Pent. He's bulkier, he hits just as hard, he still has perpetual 1-2 range. Hitting on res isn't as big a deal. But I do think that being able to Physic, or I guess the warps at the end of the game as well, push Pent that little bit over Harken. It is still incredibly close, and I think the fact that, like, many people would want Pent here is just, I don't understand why he's so overrated. I really don't. I think it might be, like, magical units feel better to use. Harken's fucking incredible, though. Like, his stats are just busted. Speaking of busted, Nino has incredibly good growths. That means she's a good unit, right? That means she's a good unit, right? Copium. Is she here or here? How much are we penalizing Corel for the fact that you don't get Harken? Is it enough that Nino ends up better than Corel? This is so silly. You know, this is silly enough that someone is going to comment about it and get mad at me for putting Corel below Nino, so I'm gonna do it. Nino is the 0 to hero. She's the Est. She's basically the only Est in Fire Emblem, even including Est, but that's a conversation for a different video that I made, actually. But yeah, Nino is the growth unit who joins at the end of the game. Her bases are pretty atrocious. I don't care that they're better than Erk's. I don't care that they're good for her level. They're bad for her join time. They're bad in comparison to the enemies around her. Nino bad, bottom text. Jafar is not bad. Jafar is actually quite good. He has very good combat. Unfortunately, he suffers a similar problem to Corel in that Jafar is one range locked, right? He joins later than Corel as well. But you don't lose out on Harkin and the Brave Sword for getting Jafar. So I think as a result of that, Jafar ends up at least a tier above Corel. Maybe 2. I think that his combat is quite good. Silencer is a meme, but he can crit stuff. He can kill stuff just by being fast and hitting hard. Maybe he's here? I don't know. I'm willing to say he's better than Erk and Louise. Maybe not Dorcas. This feels really bad because when you get Corel, when you get Jafar, he's better than Dorcas was when you had him, but you also have better units around you, right? Like, Dorcas wasn't performing particularly well in chapters 12 through 15, but you also didn't have Harkin, Pent, Hawkeye, Heath. You just had Marcus and Oswin. I think when you have Jafar, you have Harkin, Pent, Hawkeye, Heath, possibly Geats. Like, you've got people who outclass him by a significant margin. And I think as a result, the fact that he performs better than Dorcas at the time that you're using him, he's performing worse in comparison to his peers, right? I think that you do take into account how well a unit is in comparison to their peers. Vida, on the other hand, is sort of an example of how much availability can hurt an otherwise great unit, because she joins at the end of Cog of Destiny. That means that she's available for the Berserker, she's available for Sands of Time, she's available for Victory or Death, Value of Life, and the final map. And that's it. And she has, I mean, worse combat than, like, Hawkeye, Harkin, and Pent, but still pretty good combat. Like, better combat than Heath at that time, even a trained Heath. Better movement than Pent, Harkin, and Hawkeye. But she's only available for so few maps. She misses so much of the game. Is she worse than Raven? Probably. Is she worse than Knas? Probably. Is the amount of time she loses just solid but flawed? I don't think she's outclassed. So I think solid but flawed is probably a good place for her. But the amount of time that she's missing from the game is huge. So I think that it's fair to put her near the bottom of B tier. So Carla, in order to recruit Carla, you need to train Barter to level 5 warrior, and then have him fight her and not kill her. And also not be killed by her. In 0% growths, if he has an axe, there's actually a chance he kills her. This is where I have Barter. The unit who joins much later than him and can potentially get killed by him in 0% growths belongs here. This is the worst unit in the game. If you do recruit her, she's like, okay combat for 3 maps. Those maps being Victory or Death, Value of Life, and Endgame. And when I say okay, I mean like not very good. Like, you've got better units. You've got all of these fuckers. This entire squad you have, you don't need her. At least she comes as a promoted unit. I used to think she joined as a Myrmidon. That would have been hilarious. She is still definitely a joke unit, and I'm glad she exists for, like, cool lore reason stuff, but yeah, she's not very good. We're talking more and more about the units who suck because of availability, and Renault is definitely one of them. You could theoretically deploy him on the final map because you get him towards the end of Victory or Death. So he's available for Value of Life, he's available for the final map. You could theoretically deploy him in both of those maps. In the Value of Life, you have Pent, who's just better than him. Like, Pent is just better than Renault, right? Maybe you want a second Sage, Mage, Bishop person and you haven't trained anyone else. I find that unlikely. I find that very unlikely. And then in Endgame, you have Athos and Pent, both of whom are better than him. I think that maybe he's the bottom of bad filler. I could honestly see him, like, down in F tier. I think the bottom of bad filler is probably a good place for him because he theoretically can contribute in those two maps that he exists in as, like, a filler staff bot. You know, maybe Pent died and you can have him warp around, or, like, maybe you just want another physic bot because Pent and Athos are going to be doing combat. He's just not very good, though. And then Athos is the ultimate how much is availability a problem question because he's available for the final map. But he's kind of the anti-softlock measure for that map. He has busted stats. With a body ring, he doesn't get doubled by any of the bosses. He's bonkers. He's really bonkers. But he's only around for one map. He's the best way to kill the fire dragon. Trained Canas can do it as well. Athos is probably more reliable, although the fire dragon can roll up on strength and just one-shot Athos, and then whoops, there goes your kill. I think he ends up in the very bottom of Solid by Flawed, for the same reasons as Vita, basically. Like, availability is a big penalty for him. I don't think he's outclassed. Like, no one actually outclasses him. So it is just, he has the big flaw of just not existing for most of the game. So yeah, this is where I've got everyone for Hector mode. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to soak that in, and then we will go over how things change if you play Lyn mode first. So first off, I want to say that nobody who is in Lyn mode is moving down as a result of Lyn mode's existence. Wrath and Wallace are the two big examples of units who can potentially suffer from Lyn mode's existence. Wallace starts as an unpromoted unit in order to tutorialize how promotion works, and Wrath starts with worse bases in Lyn mode, and usually doesn't get the levels to make up for them. However, you can kill both of these units off, and if you do so, then they will spawn as their Hector mode versions in Hector mode. If you kill off Wallace as an unpromoted unit, then he joins as a general, and if you kill off Wrath, then he joins with his Hector mode bases and Hector mode level. So they're not moving down as a quality of Lyn mode existing, because you can always kill them off to make up for it. And even like N-Sane, if they get like level screwed or whatever, you can kill them off in order to get their Hector mode bases. With that said, there are potentially going to be units who move up or down. There might be units who move down who don't appear in Lyn mode, right? Who move down as a result of the meta around them shifting. The first unit who definitely moves up, you know her, you hate her, it's Florina. So Florina is available in Lyn mode. I guess I should clarify, I'm not giving units credit for the work they do in Lyn mode, because Lyn mode is such an easy portion of the game that I Lyn soloed it with 0% growths. You do not need to be a good unit to beat Lyn mode. You do not get credit for doing work in Lyn mode. Doing work in Lyn mode is free. The units who move up for their existence in Lyn mode move up because they benefit from something they are given in Lyn mode and carry those benefits into Hector mode. So Florina can get around growth unit problems because she has, I think it's 6 levels? Yeah, she has 6 chapters to grind levels on. 7 actually, if you count the Gaiden. She has 7 chapters to grind levels on. In addition to that, there is an angelic robe and an energy ring, and she is the best candidate for these. If you give her one or both of these and have her get a significant amount of experience in Lyn mode, then she will join in Hector mode with very respectable combat as your first flyer. And I think that that puts her in S tier. I think she becomes among the best units in the game. Not only is she your first flyer, but she becomes your best combat flyer. She's ready for promotion as soon as you get the first Elysian Whip in Pirate Ship. I think that's chapter 18. And she just continues to stomp through the game after that. Her low con definitely still hurts a little bit, but she's not going to get doubled if she levels up speed a bunch in Lyn Mode. And her bulk really, it doesn't fully get fixed by the Angelic Robe, but the addition of levels and Angelic Robe means that her HP and defense will be much higher than expected. And res is something that is sometimes valuable in FE7. Again, we meme on it, but Cog of Destiny is one of the few maps where even if you have high res, you want a Pure Water, right? Because it just makes you better against the Valkyries. So yeah, I think that she becomes an S tier unit. Actually, fuck it. I think she's above Ninian in that case. In Lyn Mode, she becomes this, and honestly, this isn't unreasonable. I don't think she is. But it's not unreasonable. I mean, actually, she has flight. No, the weapon ranks. I think the weapon ranks are the only thing holding him above her if you play Lyn Mode. Because she has flight, and they're going to have similar bases, quote-unquote bases, in Hector mode. And then she gets promotion bonuses, and she has better growth than him. And she can rescue a promoted Hector. A lot of upside. I also think Sane moves up to S tier. So Sane can take Wallace's Night Crest and become Marcus number 2. Now, he is a worse Marcus for 2 reasons. One, you don't have him as soon. You don't get him until chapter 16. Yeah, chapter 16. Noble Eve Kalen. He also has worse weapon ranks. He's not going to have... I mean, Marcus has A-rank swords, A-rank lances, and B-rank axes. Even if you abuse Lyn Mode to try to grind Sane's weapon level, bosses in Lyn Mode are too weak to boss abuse. I also don't factor in boss abuse, but Sane is not approaching Marcus's weapon ranks. You probably get Silver Lance. You definitely don't get Silver Axe. You definitely don't get Silver Sword. And Silver Lance isn't guaranteed. He is still just Marcus number 2, though, if you train him and promote him in Lyn Mode. You just get another Marcus. I guess theoretically his growths are slightly better than Marcus's, but not by enough that it matters. He will have slightly better quote-unquote bases than Marcus at that point as well. But again, not by enough that it matters. Marcus is still, because of the ranks, he's still going to be doing better combat than Sane even when Sane joins. And once Sane grinds the ranks, the game is probably almost over at that point. I think the existence of Sane as a paladin pushes Lyn down. And I think it pushes him down to outclassed. I think Lyn takes the place that Sane was in. It's not quite as extreme. I think it's here. Because he does have that early game, and he still does early game stuff, right? But there is now no reason to invest in him. There's no reason to spend that experience on Lyn, because you're just going to get Sane. You're just going to drop him, or make him your secondary priority. That does mean that, the Knight's Crest is slightly less competed over for him. However, Wallace is still fighting him for it. Or not Wallace. Fuck Wallace, no. Oswin is still fighting him for it, right? And I think that, if anything, Oswin gets a more compelling case for the Knight's Crest in that case. I think Lyn's probably over Guy, because you can't just make him Paladin number 3. But I think the existence of Paladin Sane hurts Lyn a lot. Kent doesn't really move as a result of that, mostly for the same reasons as Sane, right? Is you're not giving the Night Crest to Kent. He's just a strictly worse version of Sane. Dorcas probably doesn't move. Wrath probably doesn't move. I think Sera goes solid but flawed. And it's because her staff rank and magic stat will be higher as a result of just naturally seeing use in Lyn Mode. I think she ends up here, because she will have the higher staff rank. You can buy physics in the secret shop in Dragon's Gate, and Priscilla probably has the rank for it at that point, but Sera probably has the magic lead. So it's not as cut and dry as it is in just Hector mode, where Priscilla is just strictly better. Like, Sera will, because of the immense amount of levels and staff length that she gets, potentially... I mean, Sera honestly might be a candidate for the Guiding Ring at that point, just to boost her magic and let her physic from a slightly longer range. I still think Canas is probably better, but Sera's not the worst option. Urk does not move up, but Lucius does. And the reason is that Urk and Lucius, they don't join so far apart from each other that you can't invest some levels into Lucius. If you are investing Lyn Mode levels into Lucius, I think that he moves to bottom of solid but flawed. I think that the fact that you can invest Lyn Mode levels into Lucius and get him closer to promotion, you're never going to get him as close as Canas, right? So Canas is 2 levels, but you can get Lucius to the point where he's only 4 levels instead of 7. And 4 levels is a lot less of a steep ask than 7, especially when you factor in that C rank stabs are a legitimate upside over the E rank stabs, right? If their combat is close to identical, pick the one who gets a better staff rank on promotion. And it does mean that you do have to spend some more on Lucius. Honestly, I think actually he pulls up to right behind Canas. Yeah, I think this seems right. Wallace doesn't move. Lyn doesn't move. Actually, with Lyn mode, is Lyn better than Eliwood? Probably not. No, I don't think Lyn moves. And Mathew doesn't move because Mathew's already super high. I don't think you can do anything to make Mathew better. Like, Mathew is so fucking good. And Will doesn't move either. Like, Will's utility is the suicide strat. Getting levels in Lyn mode will never get him to the point where he doesn't die to those pegs. But it also doesn't matter because he doesn't need to not die to the pegs. I think this is it. I think this is what the tier list would look like if you played Lyn mode prior to playing Hector mode. Let me know, as always, if you have any questions or any feedback in the comments. I'm happy to hear what other people think. FE7 isn't the game that I'm most familiar with, but it is a game that I've spent a lot of time with, and I think I have enough familiarity to make a fairly accurate tier list. I know one of my friends thinks that Florina should be in B tier, but other than that, I'm not sure what other... I mean, I know the Pent stuff is going to be contentious. I am 100% certain that this tier is in the correct order. Other than that, I'm not really sure what people might have problems with, so I'm curious to hear what people think about these rankings. Let me know in the comments. Yeah, bye-bye.